Chapter 44-31. 3 months of time passed by peacefully like this. On this evening, Xianxia fleet was flying over a sparkling lake, hurrying on their journey as usual. While advancing, most of the soldiers were circulating their energy to treat their injuries in the divine ships, seizing the time to increase their strength. Only a few soldiers were in charge of operating the divine ships, as well as taking on the task of guarding. Ji Tianxing was still following behind the fleet, not making a sound. He was waiting for the Xianxia fleet to stop. Only then would he find a chance to make his move. But something he did not expect happened. The boundless lake below his feet looked very calm. The lake water was clear. Beside the lake were lofty mountains, forests, and a sea of flowers. The environment was very quiet and secluded. There were also many divine beasts and birds, flying over the lake in groups. Not to mention how many cultivation resources and natural treasures this place contained. Just this kind of otherworldly environment was worth living in, opening a cave and Dao right. The soldiers operating the divine ships in the Xianxia fleet, monitoring the surroundings and acting as guards, also had the same idea. But right at this time, 100,000 li in front of the fleet, the calm lake suddenly surged with huge waves. More than 30 enormous whirlpools appeared. Whoosh whoosh, whoosh whoosh whoosh. In the blink of an eye, the endless waves condensed into 36 enormous pillars of water, transforming into 36 water dragons that soared into the sky, baring their fangs and brandishing their claws, staring at the Xianxia fleet with fierce gazes. Every light jade-colored water dragon was several thousand li long, as if they were real, emitting the dignified aura of a divine dragon. In front of the 36 water dragons, tens of thousands of blades of light condensed in the air above the lake. Some were shaped like blades, some like swords, some like lightning, sharp shuttles and long spears. More than 60,000 blades of light formed a huge net, covering an area of several tens of thousands of li. The 36 awe-inspiring water dragons also formed a 30,000 li wide wall of water, blocking the path of the Xianxia fleet. Even though the method of condensing the water dragons and blades of light with the divine power of heaven and earth could be used by all divine lord experts. But the 36 water dragons and tens of thousands of blades of light that appeared on the lake was definitely not the work of a divine lord expert. Even some mid- and high-level divine kings were intimidated by the aura of the water dragons and blades of light, feeling fear in their hearts. Very clearly, that was at least the method displayed by a peak divine king. This sudden turn of events shocked the soldiers operating the divine warship and the guards. After being stunned for a moment, they quickly calmed down and reported the situation to their superior. Furthermore, all of the divine battleships decelerated at the same time and quickly activated all kinds of matrices. They accumulated great power and aimed at the water dragons and light blades in front of them. Once the other party launched an attack, the various god warships would be able to resist and counterattack immediately. At the same time, the soldiers also sounded the alarm and quickly woke up most of the soldiers on the divine ship. Above the broad lake, 36 water dragons glared at Ji Hao simultaneously, widely opened their mouths and bared their terrifying tusks, letting out strong and majestic roars. They shouted out a few syllables in unison, which gathered together to form a deafening, earth-shattering roar. Even though Ji Tianxing and the soldiers knew that the 36 water dragons were shouting, they were probably trying to intimidate the fleet. But unfortunately, no one could understand what the water dragons were yelling about. Many of the soldiers came from various races in the god world, and there were also foreign races from various galaxies. Ji Tianxing was even more knowledgeable. He was proficient in the languages of the human race, the god race, the demon race, the dragon race, the phoenix race, and countless other races. However, no one could understand what the 36 water dragons were shouting. Ji Tianxing was proficient in the language of the dragon race, so he could accurately tell that it was not the language of the dragon race. He immediately realized that the roar just now was shouted through the mouths of the 36 water dragons. In reality, the ones who were really shouting were the natives of the planet of origin. As I expected, there are indeed intelligent races on the planet of origin, and their strength and cultivation are not low. Ji Tianxing also wanted to know what the natives of the planet of origin looked like and what cultivation level they were at. Also, how would the Prajna God Emperor deal with such a situation? He hid his own whereabouts and aura, hiding at the side of the fleet, and observed the changes quietly. At this time, the fleet of more than 400 divine warships had already slowed down, but they continued to fly toward the water dragons and the light blades in the sky, with no intention of stopping. In the various divine warships, the God King generals had already been awakened, and a portion of the God Lord generals had also quickly gathered. In an extremely short period of time, the God generals understood the situation and reported to God King Xianxia and the others for instructions. Under normal circumstances, this fleet was jointly managed by God King Xianxia and 2 other peak God Kings. God King Xianxia was the leader, and the other 2 were his assistants. As long as it was not a matter of life and death, they could make their own decisions. There was no need to ask the Prajna God Emperor for everything. Even though there were 36 water dragons and tens of thousands of light blades on the surface of the lake in front of them. But the 3 peak God Kings had estimated that it was at most a divine ability used by a peak God King. It was not a big deal. They had 3 peak God Kings, more than 1,000 God King experts, more than 90,000 God Lords, and even the God Emperor. If such a powerful fleet was stopped by a mere 36 water dragons, wouldn't they lose all face? Thus, God King Xianxia and the other 2 did not ask the Prajna God Emperor for instructions. They directly ordered the commanders of the various divine warships to be on guard against the enemy's attack. Reality proved that the Prajna God Emperor had the same idea. She had long since noticed the abnormality and saw the water dragons and light blades. But she did not say anything to stop them. Instead, she quietly observed the situation. She did not care about the water dragons and light blades at all. At this time, her attention was on the lake within a radius of 100,000 miles. She was silently using divine abilities and secret arts to investigate the surrounding 100,000 miles to see if there was anything strange. What did the natives of the planet of origin look like, and what was their strength? At the same time, the 36 water dragons saw that the fleet was not only not stopping, but also continuing to advance. The distance between the 2 sides was still closing. The water dragons were finally enraged, and they let out a roar that sounded like "kill." In the next moment, tens of thousands of light blades of different shapes, carrying a divine power that could destroy everything, slashed at the Prajna God Emperor's fleet. More than 400 divine warships were enveloped by the light blades. The light blades that filled the sky formed a sword net that intertwined and strangled the divine warships, producing sharp whistling sounds. The commanders of the various divine warships issued orders as quickly as they could. They had the divine warships activate their defensive matrices and form a protective barrier of divine light. Countless light blades hit the divine light shield and let out a series of loud clanging noises, which reverberated in the air above the lake. The defensive light shield of the divine warships was very strong, and the light blades were also very sharp. After countless collisions, the 2 sides could not determine a winner. They were constantly breaking and melting. Chapter 44-32. In the blink of an eye, a third of the tens of thousands of light blades had been shattered, turning into divine light fragments that dissipated into the air. Half of the defensive light shields of the 400-odd divine warships had also been shattered, filled with cracks and holes. However, the soldiers operating the divine warships continued to activate the divine array without any regard for their own safety, quickly repairing the defensive light shields. When the light blades and the defensive light shields collided, the resulting explosion of divine light fragments and shockwaves mixed into a violent 5-colored flood that spread out in all directions. The vast and boundless lake stirred up huge waves. Strong winds blew across the sky as divine light flashed. However, the spatial barrier was not broken, nor were there any black spatial cracks. The light blades that filled the sky and the more than 400 divine warships were actually evenly matched, neither side gaining the upper hand. At this moment, the 36 water dragons let out loud dragon roars as they lunged at the fleet with bared fangs and brandished claws. They shot out tens of thousands of water arrows at the hundreds of divine warships as they extended their dragon claws and attacked the numerous divine warships. Bang, 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 bang. A series of muffled sounds erupted as the water arrows filled the sky and struck the hundreds of divine warships. The defensive light shields were on the verge of collapse as countless cracks appeared. The soldiers operating the divine warships did not have time to repair the holes in the defensive light shields before they were attacked even more violently. They were instantly thrown into disarray. Qi Xia Godly King and the other two peak Godly Kings frowned as they saw this scene. A solemn look flashed across their eyes. It is clearly an ordinary divine power. How can it be so powerful? No matter how you look at it, this is an array set up by a peak Godly King. Why is the divine power used so ridiculously powerful? Could it be that the natives of the planet of origin have a better grasp of divine power and nomological laws than we do? The three peak Godly Kings realized that they had underestimated the natives of the planet of origin who were hiding in the dark. Seeing the 36 water dragons swooping down and attacking the divine warships in the vanguard, the three peak Godly Kings immediately flew out. Evil dragon! You are courting death. Take this. You are courting death. The three of them knew very well that the attack of the 36 water dragons was too terrifying. It was far more powerful than the full power attack of an ordinary peak Godly King. The divine warships that were hit by the water dragons would definitely not come out unscathed. They would all be damaged to varying degrees. Under such circumstances, they had to step forward bravely and perform their divine abilities in order to fend off the water dragons. In the next instant, the three peak divine kings rushed to the front of the fleet and unleashed their full power, using their trump cards. The three powerful warriors had all transformed into giants that were thousands of miles tall. Their bodies were shining with a dazzling golden light as they had 3 heads and 6 arms. They wielded their weapons and blocked the 36 water dragons. Bang! Bang bang bang! In a blink of an eye, the 36 water dragons drowned out the figures of the 3 peak divine kings. Both sides collided fiercely, erupting with an earth-shaking bang. Only 3 water dragons managed to land on a few divine warships, shattering their defensive light shields and sending them flying out of the warships. The remaining 33 water dragons were all stopped by Crimson Afterglow Godly Monarch Trio. Furthermore, more than 20 of the water dragons were shattered into pieces. They turned into a flood that covered the sky and covered the earth, sprinkling into the lake. The remaining water dragons were also incomplete. They no longer looked majestic and even looked a little comical. Swoosh! Swoosh swoosh! The few incomplete water dragons dove into the lake one after another, disappearing without a trace. On the surface, it looked like the divine ability attack had been neutralized and Crimson Afterglow Godly Monarch Trio had won. But in reality, the trio had been sent flying several hundred miles. Their hair was disheveled and they were in a sorry state. The other 2 peak divine kings had suffered minor injuries, blood seeping out of their noses and mouths. However, they had managed to circulate their energy to suppress their injuries and stabilize their chaotic blood. This was to prevent their subordinates from seeing them and losing their dignity. Originally, the fleet could have continued forward without the obstruction of the water dragons and blades of light. But at this moment, the Prajna God Emperor, who had been using divine abilities and secret arts to observe an area of 100,000 miles, suddenly ordered the fleet to stop. Crimson Afterglow Godly Monarch Trio guessed that the Prajna God Emperor must have discovered something. Thus, the entire fleet obeyed the order and quickly stopped in the air above the lake. Before receiving any new orders, the commanders of the various divine warships led their subordinates to quickly activate the arrays and repair the defensive barriers of the divine warships. Everyone was well aware that the destruction of the blades of light and the dissipation of the water dragons did not mean that they had won, nor did it mean that the danger had been averted. That was only the beginning. The true danger was still to come. Thus, the soldiers were very cautious. Swish! A few moments later, 2 dazzling beams of divine light appeared in the sky 100,000 miles ahead of the fleet. One was a scarlet flame that illuminated the world, and the other was an icy blue divine light. The two massive balls of divine light enveloped more than 100 figures as they rapidly leaped through the sky. In the blink of an eye, they crossed 90,000 miles and arrived in front of the fleet. Only when they were still 10,000 miles away from the Prajna fleet did the two balls of divine light slow down until they came to a stop. Crimson Afterglow and the others realized that the two balls of divine light were leaping through the sky at 2 to 3 times their speed. But just like them, the two balls of divine light were unable to use spatial shift. Very quickly, the dazzling flames and icy blue divine light receded, revealing their original appearance. When Crimson Afterglow and the soldiers saw the situation within the two balls of divine light, they immediately revealed shocked expressions. They saw that the dazzling scarlet flame was actually a divine bird as large as a mountain. Its appearance was very majestic. Its entire body was covered in scarlet and golden divine feathers, surrounded by scarlet flames. At first glance, it looked like the vermilion bird of the 5 elements divine beasts. However, it had gorgeous and dazzling tail feathers and a noble crest on its head. It was even more graceful and luxurious than the vermilion bird. Crimson Afterglow and the soldiers were still hesitant, not daring to be certain. Xianxia, however, could tell at a glance that it was the divine beast phoenix. The fire phoenix that was nearly extinct in the dragon realm and the divine realm, rarely seen in 10,000 years. As for the icy blue divine light beside it, it was a divine dragon that was hundreds of miles long. Although the dragon race was rare in the present dragon realm, they could still be seen occasionally. In the dragon realm, there were the red dragon emperor, the black dragon emperor, the sacred dragon emperor, and so on. And the icy blue divine dragon in front of them was the rare frost divine dragon. After confirming the identities of the two divine beasts, Crimson Afterglow and the soldiers were enlightened. No wonder they were so fast. But this was not the main point. Everyone's gaze was gathered on the backs of the Phoenix and Frost divine dragon. On the backs of the two divine beasts stood more than 100 figures. They were all foreign races that no one had ever seen before, and they were all wearing strange and plain clothes of the same style. Chapter 44-33. The hundreds of foreign races were all different. Some looked like elves with purple or blue skin. Some of them looked like humans, but they had pointy ears and eyes that were excessively large. Some looked like gods, but their bodies were terrifyingly tall and sturdy. In short, the appearance of the hundreds of foreign races made everyone feel unfamiliar, but they also had the illusion that they had seen them somewhere before. Of course, appearance was not the most important thing. What godly King Crimson Afterglow and the tens of thousands of soldiers focused on was the strength of the hundreds of foreign races. They were all godly kings, and all of them were high-level godly kings. Among them, there were 12 leaders who were all peak godly kings. Close to 100 high-level godly kings appearing at the same time, all wearing the same style, patterns, and emblems. This was very clear. Godly King Crimson Afterglow and the tens of thousands of soldiers immediately connected the dots. These foreign race godly kings must have come from a certain faction, and were the elite guards of that faction. As for Emperor God Panrua and Xianxia, at the same time that they confirmed this thought, more thoughts popped up in their heads. Those hundreds of foreign race godly kings are all natives of the Star of Origin, but their races are somewhat different. Therefore, their faction should not be a race, but a country or a sect. No matter their size, height, or height, they all wear the same style of clothing, which proves that they have rules and ranks. Moreover, they are not the top experts of that faction. At most, they are the elite forces, the cornerstone of that faction. In other words, the leader of this faction must have surpassed the godly king realm and reached the god emperor realm. Furthermore, these elite guards that appeared so easily are all high-level godly kings, and there are even 12 peak godly kings among them. One can imagine that this faction probably has more than one god emperor realm expert. Ordinary soldiers could only see the problem on the surface, and would not think too deeply or think too far ahead. However, Xianxia God Emperor and Xianxia were able to analyze so many key points based on what they saw in front of them. What they valued and cared about was never the number of godly kings, but the number of God Emperor realm experts. Ji Tianxing had originally thought that the ice dragons and phoenixes, who were carrying close to 100 foreign race divine kings, would aggressively block the fleet and kill them. He did not expect those hundreds of foreign race godly kings to be able to suppress their anger and killing intent. The 12 peak godly kings in the lead could also maintain their calm, staring at Xianxia fleet with vigilance, and shouted a few sentences. Although Ji Tianxing could roughly guess what those peak godly kings were shouting about. It was nothing more than questioning the origins and intentions of the Xianxia fleet, and stating that the Xianxia fleet had invaded their territory. Unfortunately, no one could understand those foreign race godly kings were unable to communicate with them. The foreign god kings also discovered this problem. After they shouted 3 times in a row and received no response, they tried to change their language. Godly. She discussed with the other 2 peak god kings to see if they could use pictures or words to communicate with the foreign god kings. At this time, Prajna God Emperor telepathically said to Crimson Afterglow God King, "Since you can't communicate with words, the pictures and symbols won't work. Try communicating with your mind." Prajna God Emperor's words reminded godly monarch Crimson Dawn, but it also startled her and made her hesitate. It was true that all creatures, regardless of race or type, had consciousness and thoughts. Even if there was a language barrier between different races, as long as they released their divine senses and opened their minds, they could communicate with each other. Communication through telepathy was not restricted by race or language. But there was a huge drawback to doing this, and that was, the side that actively released their divine sense and opened their minds would be in a completely defenseless state. If the other party harbored malicious intent and took the opportunity to attack, then his side would definitely suffer heavy losses and might even be in mortal danger. Therefore, most deities did not dare to use this method of communication. In contrast, they would rather take a simpler and cruder approach. For example, directly killing one of the foreign god kings and trying to refine their soul memories, quickly grasping their language. Godly monarch Crimson Dawn and the others had thought of this method. Although they could not do it, Prajna God Emperor could easily do it. But Prajna God Emperor had her own concerns. She did not care about the 100 foreign god kings in front of her, but she was wary of the power behind them and the god emperor. No matter how large her fleet was, they were still foreign invaders, and the other party was the native of planet origin. It was not a wise move to create enmity with the foreign god emperor as soon as they met. Therefore, Prajna God Emperor proposed the idea of telepathy. Godly monarch Crimson Dawn did not think too much, nor did she think that far. She could only follow Prajna God Emperor's orders and said to the 2 peak god kings, "You know what the god emperor means. Then I'll have to trouble the 2 of you." The 2 peak god kings complained incessantly in their hearts, "Damn it! The god emperor gave you the task, how can you dump it on us?" Although they thought so, they did not dare to show any dissatisfaction and could only bite the bullet. The 2 flew to the sky in front of the fleet and bowed to the 12 peak god kings of the foreign races. They forced a smile on their faces to show that they had no ill intentions. Then, the 2 tried to release their divine senses and open their telepathy to express goodwill to the other party. The 12 peak god kings were not natives who did not know anything and had a certain amount of knowledge. They could see that the 2 peak god kings were expressing goodwill. After sensing the other party's divine senses, they were first on guard, thinking that the other party was up to something. When they sensed that the other party had no ill intentions and was releasing goodwill, they let down their guard. The few peak god kings of the foreign races discussed for a while and made a decision. Among them, 2 peak god kings also tried to release goodwill to communicate with the other party. In the beginning, both parties were cautious and more or less on guard. But as they communicated with each other, the 4 peak god kings relaxed a lot. The conversation they communicated with their telepathy was about the same as what everyone expected. "Who are you? Where are you from? Why are you trespassing on the territory of the Kongming Temple?" "You've misunderstood. We are not trespassing and have no ill intentions. It's just that we are new here and do not know the terrain and situation here. That's why we have such a misunderstanding. Alright, even if I believe that you have no ill intentions, which race are you from? Which temple do you belong to? Chapter 44-34. The questioning of the two foreign race deity kings stunned the two peak deity kings under the pan-god emperor. These two peak deity kings were top experts from different galaxies. They were marshals under the pan-god emperor. In the past few hundred years, they had been by the side of the pan-god emperor. They were in charge of commanding tens of thousands of soldiers to maintain the formation and study the Star of Origin. In terms of experience and knowledge, they were considered to be very good. Even though Xianxia Supreme Being was the most trusted and favored by the pan-god emperor, Xianxia Supreme Being was still lacking compared to the two of them in terms of experience. Hearing the two foreign race deity kings' words, the two of them were stunned. Their hearts were in turmoil. Oh my God! I thought that these hundreds of foreign race deity kings were strong enough. I didn't expect them to have a force behind them. Kongming Temple? These hundreds of foreign race deity kings are all subordinates of the Kongming Temple? No wonder they are all wearing the same style of clothes. To be able to make 12 peak deity kings and so many upper deity kings submit, the Kongming Temple must be very powerful. They must have a god emperor in charge. Furthermore, the number of peak deity kings and upper deity kings under the Kongming Temple is far more than these 100. There could be thousands or even thousands of them. The two of them actually asked which temple we belong to. This means that other than the Kongming Temple, there are other temple forces on this planet. No, this is such important information. We must report it to the God Emperor first. Benefiting from their vast knowledge and quick reactions, the two marshals immediately stopped communicating and reported this information to the Pan-God Emperor. After the Pan-God Emperor heard this, she thought to herself, just as I expected. However, she could not decide how to reply at the moment. At this moment, the two foreign race deity kings who were in charge of communicating with their minds saw that the other party had stopped communicating and became wary again. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. As the two of them made a hand gesture, the 100 or so foreign godly kings immediately drew their swords. The Kenshin soldiers gathered a terrifying amount of divine power and were connected to the aura of heaven and earth. They were ready to attack at any moment. This was because the two alien god kings had determined from the other party's reaction that the other party was a member of an enemy force. Seeing that the Kongming Temple was about to attack again, Xianxia deity king and the two marshals were worried, but they did not dare to act rashly. Previously, they didn't know the other party's strength and background, so they were still able to fight and resist. Now that they had guessed that the Kongming Temple was powerful and had the God Emperor overseeing it, they could not act rashly. Just as the two sides were in a deadlock, the Prajna God Emperor finally appeared. Shwa! With a flash of golden light, she flew out from the most sacred and majestic battleship and arrived at the front of the fleet. She looked at the two divine beasts and the hundreds of foreign god kings with a dignified expression. Prajna was indeed the #1 beauty in the god realm. Even if the other party was of a foreign race, they could not ignore her beauty and her unique aura. The hundreds of foreign god kings looked up at her and were shocked. At the same time, they began to discuss in whispers. It's actually an emperor-level master? It seems that the power of this fleet is not to be underestimated. We do not know a lot of emperor-level experts. However, no matter how I think about it, there doesn't seem to be any emperor-level expert that looks like her. First of all, we can rule out the possibility that this emperor-level master is not from the Shangqing Temple. The other elders are all old men. How could they be so young and beautiful? Among the great emperors of the Taiyu Shrine, there are 2 women, but their appearance and aura do not match this emperor-level master in front of us. If she is not from the other 3 temples, then where did this fleet come from? Could it be that a rising star has appeared in one of the temples and wants to establish their own sect? That's very possible. Just now, the other party also said that they have just arrived and do not know that this is our territory. From this, it is very likely that they came from an extremely far away and remote place. Although our Kongming Temple is very strong and does not fear any power, they will not easily start a war with us. But this fleet has an emperor-level master and tens of thousands of soldiers. We cannot be impulsive. Let's continue to communicate and see if we can find out the other party's origin and purpose. If the hall masters can persuade the other party to let this fleet join our Kongming temple, that will be a great merit. Many foreign god kings were whispering and discussing, and their hostility towards the Prajna fleet had decreased by a lot. Of course, the main reason was the appearance of the Prajna god emperor. They had no choice but to treat it with caution. After all, this place was still very far away from the headquarters of the Kongming temple. If these 100 foreign god kings were surrounded and killed by the Prajna fleet, even if they sent out a distress signal, the experts and temple masters of the headquarters would need several days to rush over. Everyone knew that a wise man did not fight when the odds were against him. Naturally, there was no need to fight the other party head-on. The deadlock situation was resolved, and the atmosphere eased up a lot. The Prajna god emperor did not put on an overbearing attitude, and a trace of friendliness was emitted from her dignified aura. This time, she personally released her divine sense and opened her mind to communicate with the other party. Kongming Temple? This emperor has no intention to be your enemy. It is just that I do not know the situation and am passing by. Please do not blame me. If you have the sincerity to get to know each other, can you give this emperor a general overview of the situation? The Prajna god emperor was not arrogant, and did not have the extravagant hope that with her strength as a god emperor, she would be able to make the other party bow their heads and tell her the truth. Those foreign peak god kings were already suspicious of the Prajna fleet's origin, and also had the idea of taking them into the Kongming temple. The Prajna god emperor's sincerity was acknowledged by the foreign god kings. Thus, the two foreign god kings in charge of communicating with their minds, after discussing with their companions, began to communicate with the Prajna god emperor seriously. Your distinguished self is not willing to become enemies with us. I presume that you have heard of the Kongming temple's reputation. As for the illustrious reputation of the temple masters, I will not go into too much detail. What I want to tell your distinguished self is that our Kongming temple has 64 branches. Each branch has a territory of millions and millions of li, and can accommodate millions of creatures. Our Qingyu Hall is one of the 64 branches, and is stationed not far ahead. Since your distinguished self is an emperor-level expert, I presume that you were born here and grew up here. Although I do not know what your distinguished self's fleet has experienced, and why you have crossed half the world to come to our territory. However, our Kongming temple has always loved peace, and strives to provide peaceful and tranquil conditions for all of our people. If your distinguished self's fleet does not have a place to settle down for the time being, there is no harm in you coming to our territory to take a look. Perhaps you wish to find a suitable place to settle down, and our Kongming temple can help? Chapter 44-35. The 12 peak-level godly kings were all Qingyu Hall's deputy hall masters, protectors, and elders. Although Panrua God Emperor and the others did not know how many territories the so-called Qingyu Hall governed and how many people it had. But the hundreds of godly king realm guards were enough to prove that Qingyu Hall's power was not weak. Qingyu Hall was also one of the 64 halls under the Kongming temple. And the two godly kings had also said that they had several hall masters. This made Panrua God Emperor realize that Kongming temple had at least several God Emperor realm experts. No matter how confident she was, no matter how bold she was still shocked and fearful of the unfamiliar Kongming temple. Fortunately, the Qingyu Hall's deputy hall masters, protectors, and elders did not show any hostility. They even took the initiative to express their goodwill, with the intention of helping and recruiting Panrua's fleet. This made Panrua God Emperor realize that there was still room for manipulation. If she could use this opportunity appropriately, she might be able to gain a foothold on the planet of origin very quickly. Of course, before she truly understood the situation, she was still wary and vigilant of Kongming Temple and Qingyu Hall. At the same time, she would not consider joining the Kongming Temple, even if the Kongming Temple was really as peace-loving as the two deputy hall masters said. After all, no matter how good the Kongming Temple was, they were still natives of the planet of origin. Of course, The people she trusted the most were still the 4 god emperors who had cooperated with her for thousands of years. Since Qingyu Hall is so sincere, I naturally believe in Kongming Temple's boldness and tolerance. Although there was a bit of friction before, it was only a misunderstanding caused by a language barrier. Fortunately, there were no casualties. It just so happens that we are not familiar with this place, and indeed need to find a suitable place to stay. Then I'll have to trouble you all to take us to see. The Prajna God Emperor expressed his eagerness to the invitation of the 2 Vice Hall Masters, and his attitude was rather polite. The 2 Vice Hall Masters of Qingyu Hall had only been testing the waters. They hadn't expected that the Prajna God Emperor would actually agree. The 2 Vice Hall Masters were stunned for a moment. They hurriedly apologized to the Prajna God Emperor and asked her to wait for a moment. Afterwards, the 2 of them discussed with the other 10 protectors and elders, and then sent a message to the Master of Qingyu Hall, asking if they would really bring the Hanya fleet to Qingyu Hall's territory. If it were only the Prajna God Emperor and Crimson Dawn Godly King, the Qingyu Hall's Vice Hall Masters, elders, and protectors wouldn't be afraid even if the God Emperor was present. With the support of the Kongming Temple, as one of the 4 most powerful holy temples on the planet of origin, they had nothing to fear. However, the Prajna God Emperor's fleet had more than 400 godly warships and close to 100,000 soldiers. Vice Hall Master Qingyu and the elders were also worried. What if this fleet entered the Qingyu Hall's territory and suddenly started a massacre? What if they wanted to snatch their territory? Even if the Qingyu Hall had the advantage in numbers, they could still mobilize enough troops to contend against the Prajna fleet. Even if the other party had the God Emperor, the Qingyu Hall was confident that they could stop the other party's invasion after paying a huge price. However, the Qingyu Hall would pay a huge price, and they might not be able to recover for many years. Could the Qingyu Hall bear such a huge risk? The 2 Vice Hall Masters, elders, and protectors didn't have the courage to make the decision on their own. The 12 peak godly kings discussed for a moment, and half of them agreed. They felt that risk and opportunity coexisted, and it was worth a try. The Prajna fleet looked like a newly risen power that had no home to return to. If they could successfully recruit the Prajna fleet as a subordinate of the Kongming Temple, it would be a great achievement. Since the Prajna God Emperor was humble and wasn't arrogant and domineering, they could give it a try. The other half of them were still against the idea. They felt that this was too risky. After all, they didn't know the other party's background and intentions. It was wishful thinking to try and recruit an emperor-level expert into the Kongming Temple. It would be fine if nothing happened, but if something did happen, the Qingyu Hall wouldn't be able to bear such a heavy blow. The 12 peak godly kings couldn't come to a decision, so they could only wait for the Master of Qingyu Hall to make a decision. Everyone waited for 100 breaths of time before they received a message from the Master of Qingyu Hall. Everyone knew that the Master of Qingyu Hall had always been steady and mature, but his decisions surprised everyone. They didn't expect that the Master of Qingyu Hall would actually agree. With this, the elders and protectors, who were divided into 2 factions, could finally stop arguing. The 2 Vice Hall Masters smiled sincerely and said to the Prajna God Emperor, "My lord, Qingyu Hall welcomes your arrival. Please follow us and your fleet to 7 Moon Mountain. That is where Qingyu Hall's headquarters is located. While we are on the way, we can get to know each other better. At the same time, let me introduce you to the Qingyu Hall's situation." Both sides reached an agreement on this matter. One of the Vice Hall Masters of Qingyu Hall invited the Prajna God Emperor to board the Fire Phoenix. The 2 of them stood on the Fire Phoenix's back, turned around, and flew to the other side of the lake. The ice dragon carried dozens of godly kings of other races and streaked across the sky. After a dragon's roar, it disappeared into the horizon. The Prajna God Emperor followed the people of Qingyu Hall and left on the Fire Phoenix. Godly King Xia and the others did not hesitate. They immediately ordered the fleet to follow at full speed. Although Godly King Xia and the 2 marshals could not understand why the Prajna God Emperor wanted to follow the other party to visit some Qingyu Hall. They did not want to interact with the natives of the Star of Origin. They would rather find a unique secret realm to establish their footing and develop their own forces. However, since the Prajna God Emperor gave the order, They could only obey. The generals and soldiers of the more than 400 warships were also at a loss and puzzled. However, they did not even know the inside story. They could only follow the order and speculate in private. From the Boundless Lake to the Qin Yu Hall's headquarters, Seven Moon Mountain, even the Ice Dragon and the Fire Phoenix had to fly for an entire day. The Prajna fleet's more than 400 godly warships had to fly at full speed to barely keep up with the Ice Dragon and the Fire Phoenix. Of course, this was because the Vice Hall Masters of Qin Yu Hall deliberately slowed down the speed of the two godly beasts out of consideration for the Prajna fleet's reputation. If they really flew at full speed, the Prajna fleet would quickly lose them. It could not be helped. The godly dragon and the Fire Phoenix were good at flying. They had lived on the Star of Origin for tens of thousands of years and had long adapted to this world. During the journey, not only were the soldiers of the Prajna fleet discussing this in private, even the more than 100 godly kings of Qin Yu Hall were secretly discussing this through voice transmissions. Hasn't the Hall Master always been mature and prudent, and almost never makes risky decisions? The Hall Master actually agreed? I still feel that this matter is not simple. I think it might be related to that matter. The Hall Master is probably a little anxious. He has been under a lot of pressure recently. What matter are you talking about? This? You have to ask the Vice Hall Master and the Guardians. Chapter 44-36. Some of the guard captains who didn't know what was going on went to ask the elders and protectors. The protectors couldn't answer their questions too clearly, so they could only give a simple explanation. 200 years ago, the temple masters issued a secret order for the 64 branches of our Kongming Temple to carry out a mission in secret. Over the years, we have investigated almost all the living beings in the territory and have a clear understanding of their talents and aptitudes. You don't need to know the reason, you only need to know that it's an order and a mission from the temple. Many of the branch missions have made progress, but our Qin Yu Hall still hasn't made any progress. The temple masters have already criticized and reprimanded the hall master several times, so how can the hall master not be worried? Alright, this isn't something you should worry about. Just follow the hall master's orders. Before the conflict erupts, that fleet is our guest, so don't be rude. Of course, you must also remain vigilant and alert. If you discover anything unusual, report it immediately. The two protectors gave a concise explanation, but didn't say what exactly was going on. The captains, deacons, and guards still didn't understand. However, they understood the two protectors' meaning, which was to follow orders and not ask what they shouldn't ask. Just like that, the 100 or so divine king experts of Qin Yu Hall quickly quieted down. On the other side, the Prajna God Emperor and a Vice Hall Master stood side by side on the back of a Fire Phoenix. The two of them looked at the blue sky and sea of clouds in front of them at the same time, conversing at a moderate pace. Vice Hall Master Qin Yu first asked about the Prajna God Emperor's origins and intentions, even though he suspected that the other party was a new power that had been forced to flee here. However, this was only his guess, and he had to get confirmation from the Prajna God Emperor. The Prajna God Emperor was very wise and farsighted. Through observation, he guessed the Vice Hall Master's thoughts. Thus, she followed the other party's guess and made up a series of lies. We came from an extremely distant place on the other side of the sky. Our hometown was originally a picturesque place, peaceful and quiet. We lived there for generations, standing aloof from worldly affairs. It wasn't until 100 years ago that a powerful force, claiming to be some great temple, appeared in our homeland. The Prajna God Emperor's words were vague and secretive. When the Vice Hall Master heard this, he believed 70 to 80% of it and filled in some information on his own. It seems that this great emperor and her clansmen really do live in a very remote area. They haven't been discovered by the temples for many years. The Great Divine Temple? Could it be someone from the Taiyu Shrine? It should be them. After all, they have always been arrogant and loathsome. When these thoughts appeared in his mind, the Vice Hall Master took the initiative to ask the Prajna God Emperor, "Sire, please forgive me for taking the liberty to ask. You and your people have always lived in a remote place, aloof from worldly affairs. Then, where did you and your clansmen get their cultivation methods? This question was a bit of a test for the Prajna God Emperor. If he answered incorrectly, he would be exposed. The Prajna God Emperor's expression didn't change. He pretended to be puzzled and asked, "Then, where did you get your cultivation methods?" The Vice Hall Master replied without hesitation, "We are the people of the Kongming Temple. The cultivation methods we cultivate are naturally passed down from the temple." The Prajna God Emperor continued to ask, "Then, where did the Kongming Temple's cultivation methods come from? It can't be made up out of thin air, right?" The Vice Hall Master was startled. He smiled bitterly and said, "Sire, you must be joking. Heaven and earth are orderly, the Tao is natural. All cultivation methods originate from heaven and earth. Although the great Tao originates from heaven and earth, living beings are slow-witted and difficult to comprehend. Thus, the Tao of heaven felt it and sent down the peerless heavenly book to enlighten all living beings." It was very clear that the Vice Hall Master's words were the common and tacit words of the people of the Kongming Temple. As for whether this saying was true or not, only the founder of the Kongming Temple knew. However, the Prajna God Emperor would rather believe it to be true. After all, Shi, Azura, Yu Ming, Lu Zhiyang, Dao Xingyun and the others had relied on half of the eternal heavenly book to become God Emperor. The Prajna God Emperor smiled naturally and explained, "This emperor and my clansmen have never come into contact with any temples. Naturally, we can't obtain any inheritance. Our cultivation methods are the revelations of heaven and earth. We spend all our time comprehending and pondering over them." When the Vice Hall Master heard this, his expression did not change. However, he was rather shocked inwardly. He thought to himself, "They can actually obtain revelations from heaven and earth without the teachings and inheritance of the temple? Could it be that this is the person that the Hall Master and the other Hall Masters are looking for, a person with extraordinary talent and aptitude?" When he thought of this, the Vice Hall Master's heart skipped a beat. His emotions fluctuated for a moment. Fortunately, he suppressed his excitement in time and did not reveal any abnormalities. However, what kind of person was the Prajna God Emperor? She immediately noticed the Vice Hall Master's abnormality. She was also puzzled. She thought to herself, "They are certain that the cultivation method is passed down from the temple and originated from the eternal heavenly book? I only said that I obtained the revelations of heaven and earth, and he actually had such a huge reaction. As a peak divine king, he actually could not suppress the excitement in his heart. There is a problem here." The two of them had their own thoughts. They continued to communicate without batting an eyelid, trying to understand each other's details. What the Vice Hall Master wanted to understand was the Prajna God Emperor's origin, situation, and intentions. Only then could he make more precise arrangements and plans. Through his communication with the Prajna God Emperor, he learned that the Prajna God Emperor's clan had been discovered by a certain temple. They were to be taken under the temple's command and be managed and governed. However, the Prajna God Emperor's clansmen loved freedom and were unwilling to be restricted. Thus, they clashed with the temple's power. Fortunately, it was only a branch of a certain temple, and the Prajna God Emperor's clansmen emerged victorious in the conflict. However, the temple found out about this matter, and the temple master was furious. He sent out a large number of experts to capture the Prajna God Emperor and suppress his clansmen. Helpless, the Prajna God Emperor could only flee with his clansmen and leave their home. Their fleet was chased for several decades before they managed to escape the temple's sphere of influence. However, the fleet did not dare to stop. They could only continue to advance, until they passed by that large lake and met the divine kings of the Qingyu Hall. The story of the Prajna God Emperor came to an end. The answer was basically what the Vice Hall Master expected, but the details were a bit vague. However, the Vice Hall Master had never left the Kongming Temple's sphere of influence in his life. He could not be said to have much knowledge. Naturally, he could not tell the truth from the lies. Even his knowledge of the other three temples was taught to him by the master of Qingyu Hall. Through this exchange, the Prajna God Emperor also gained a more detailed understanding of the Qingyu Hall's power. Chapter 44-37. The name Qingyu Hall did not sound majestic. It was rather ordinary. According to ordinary people's imaginations, it was a branch of some faction that controlled a few cities. However, in reality, the Star of Origin, which was 10 times bigger than the God Realm, did not have trillions of living beings. There were also no continents or god kingdoms. On this planet, the 4 great temples were supreme. They ruled over all races and territories. Every temple had tens to hundreds of races under their command. They were divided into different branches. The territory of each branch was about 100 million miles wide. It was much bigger than the god kingdoms in the God Realm. Of course, it was not much smaller than a territory. Moreover, the territory controlled by the 4 great temples was only half of the Star of Origin. The other half of the territory was ownerless. Without so many living beings, the 4 great temples did not need to occupy the entire Star of Origin. Within the 100 million miles of Qingyu Hall's territory, there were about 200,000 living beings. Compared to the other branches of the Kongming Temple, Qingyu Hall was located at the edge of the territory. It was more remote and had fewer living beings. However, when the Prajna God Emperor learned that the weakest among the 200,000 living beings, the women and children, were heavenly gods and godly lords. Half of the living beings were godly kings, he was stunned. In the God Realm, every godly king was a 1 in a billion genius. They were extremely respected experts. In the entire God Realm, there were less than 3,000 godly kings in all 5 continents. On the Star of Origin, all living beings were heavenly gods the moment they were born. Even if they did not have the talent for cultivation and could not cultivate the techniques passed down by the temples, they could naturally reach godly Lord Realm as they grew older. If they were slightly more talented and worked harder, they would definitely become a godly king after cultivating for hundreds or thousands of years. As for those who cultivated for more than 10,000 years and had outstanding talent and comprehension, they had a high chance of becoming an upper-level godly king. Therefore, the 3,000 guards of Qingyu Hall were all upper-level godly kings. There were even as many as 18 peak godly kings. Only 12 of them were present today. The other 6 peak godly kings were guarding the headquarters on 7 Moons Mountain. Since the establishment of Qingyu Hall 10,000 years ago, it had never experienced any disasters or wars. It had always been peaceful. Therefore, Qingyu Hall only had 3,000 guards. If there was a crisis of life and death, and the entire population was mobilized, that would be 100,000 god kings and 100,000 god monarchs. Such a terrifying battle prowess would suffocate anyone who heard it. Qingyu Hall was just one of the branches of Kongming Temple, and it was one of the weaker branches. One could only imagine how powerful the Kongming Temple was. The mere thought of it caused the Prajna God Emperor's mouth to go dry. His heart was filled with shock, fear, and jealousy. After all, the Star of Origin was the origin of the universe and the source of all power. The living beings of this world were born gods. While the Sanskrit fleet followed Vice Hall Master Clear Moon and the others to 7 Moons Mountain, Ji Tianxing did not remain idle. He could not hear the conversation between the Prajna God Emperor and Vice Hall Master Clear Moon. However, he could guess some clues from the change in attitude of both sides, as well as the Prajna God Emperor's change in expression and the final decision he made. Based on his understanding of the Prajna God Emperor, the other party's background was definitely not small. Their forces were definitely very powerful, and there was a God Emperor overseeing them. Otherwise, the Prajna God Emperor would definitely not follow the other party to their territory. Ji Tianxing secretly calculated. It was his first time on the Star of Origin, and he was in the dark. It was safer to observe and gather information first. He could not always follow the Prajna fleet while invisible. He could not communicate with the godly kings of the other races in Qingyu Hall. It was not beneficial for him to gather information. Therefore, he decided to sneak into the Prajna God Emperor's fleet and take over the body of a certain general on the divine ship. If the Prajna God Emperor was overseeing the fleet, this idea would be somewhat difficult and risky. However, the Prajna God Emperor was at the front, standing on the back of the Fire Phoenix and communicating with Vice Hall Master Clear Moon. He was thousands of miles away from the fleet. This was an excellent opportunity for Ji Tianxing. he decisively approached the Prajna fleet and aimed at the divine ship at the very back of the fleet. He secretly used a divine ability and secret technique to break through the divine ship's defensive formation and enter the divine ship. In fact, this divine ship at the very back of the fleet was above average in terms of overall strength in the fleet. If its overall strength was too weak, it would not have been placed at the very back of the fleet to hold the line. However, to the current Ji Tianxing, it was just a high-grade king-level divine ship. Even if it was protected by a top-grade king-level divine formation, he could infiltrate it in an instant. After infiltrating the divine ship, he entered the depths of the divine ship as if there was no one around and rushed to the secret room where the general was. In the short span of 10 breaths, he had figured out the positions of the more than 200 soldiers on the divine warship. He had even predicted everyone's next move. There was a total of 260 soldiers, all of them in a state of alert. Half of them were guarding the entrance and passageway, while the remaining 100 soldiers were on standby in the main hall. There were another 20 soldiers who were in charge of controlling the formation and could activate the divine cannons at any time to engage in battle. Of the last 10 soldiers, 8 of them were controlling the divine formation in the control room and were in charge of steering the divine ship. Only 2 guards were guarding the entrance of a secret room in the depths of the divine ship. In that secret room, there was a 7th-degree realm high-grade divine king, who was the general commanding the divine ship. Ji Tianxing was invisible and had no presence at all. He walked straight to the entrance of the secret room and the 2 guards could not see him. He flicked his finger lightly and the 2 guards fainted without noticing. They did not fall to the ground but remained standing on the spot like stone statues. Then Ji Tianxing looked at the door of the secret room and his eyes became deeper and clearer. Soon he saw through the defensive formation. He used a little trick and easily broke the formation and opened the door of the secret room. At this moment, the 7th-level Divine King Realm General was thinking about something in the secret room. Suddenly, he saw the door of the secret room open and subconsciously turned his head to look. He frowned and scolded in a deep voice, "Bastard, how dare you barge in without any notice?" He could not see Ji Tianxing, so he naturally thought that it was one of his generals who came to report the news. However, he was only halfway through his sentence when he stopped abruptly. A formless and terrifying divine power, like the suppression of heaven and earth, sealed him in an instant, causing him to lose all ability to move. He could not even speak. His heart was filled with shock and fear, but he could not call for help or save himself. There was only one thought in his mind: could it be that those damned strange races on the surface, they are taking us to their territory, but in reality, it is a trap and they want to kill us halfway? Before he could think about whether the fleet was in danger or whether the Prajna God Emperor had noticed anything strange, at this moment, a formless divine power invaded his mind and instantly destroyed his godhead. Chapter 44:38. This divine general did not die peacefully. The moment he lost consciousness, his mind was still filled with fear and anxiety. But fortunately, his death was relatively sudden and he did not feel any pain. A moment later, the divine general who had just died came back to life. There was no doubt that he had been possessed by Ji Tianxing. In order not to reveal any flaws, Ji Tianxing could only close the door of the secret room, spend some time to refine this person's divine deity fragment, and plunder the memories of the soul. Just as Ji Tianxing was refining the divine deity fragment, the 2 guards guarding the door of the secret room naturally woke up. The 2 of them were still standing straight at the door, without any abnormalities. But both of them felt a little strange, as if they had lost consciousness for a moment just now. That time was very short, like half a quarter of an hour, but also like a breath. It felt very unreal, like a dream, so the 2 guards did not dare to confirm it. Even though the 2 of them were apprehensive for a while, they were not too sure and quietly asked each other. But the result was still unsettled. After all, there was no change in the 2 of them and the door of the secret room. Looking around, nothing happened. The 2 of them could only treat this small accident as them being absent-minded at the same time. Moreover, the 2 of them had to keep this secret and not let the divine general know. Otherwise, if they were distracted while on duty, they would be punished. 2 hours later, Ji Tianxing in the secret room had already refined the Divine General's Divine Deity fragment and obtained the corresponding soul memories. Feiyang Shenwang, 7th Realm Strength, trusted subordinate of Divine King Qi Xia, one of the domain lords of the Chaotic Continent. Simply put, this Feiyang Shenwang came from the God Realm and followed Divine King Qi Xia to seek refuge with the God Emperor of Prajna. From now on, Ji Tianxing would use this identity to mix in with the Prajna fleet and explore the secrets of Qingyu Hall and Kongming Temple. A day passed quickly. The Prajna God Emperor and his subordinates found that a day on the origin star seemed to be longer. Moreover, there was no obvious difference between day and night. All the stars were very bright. Even the so-called night was only a little darker than the day. It was like the brightness of a cloudy day. The two god beasts brought the Hanya fleet and successfully arrived at 7 Moon Mountain, the headquarters of Qingyu Hall. Even though they were still 100,000 li away, they could already see 7 particularly prominent mountain peaks in the boundless mountain range. The mountain peak was like a crescent moon, undulating in a smooth arc. It was concave in the middle and pointed at both ends. It was very unique. The 7 crescent-shaped mountain peaks were scattered in picturesque disorder. They were located at the top of the vast mountain range and were especially eye-catching. This region was the place with the most abundant heaven and earth divine energy within 100 million miles of the territory. It was also known as the Divine Range. The 7 crescent-shaped mountain peaks were the starting points of the Holy Range. Naturally, it was the best place to cultivate. Qingyu Hall chose 7 Moon Mountain as their headquarters. They built a floating city on top of the 7 mountain peaks, surrounded by hundreds of majestic palaces and buildings. From afar, 7 Moon Mountain had both the mystery of the Holy Range and the grandeur and solemnity of the place. Qingyu Hall had more than 200,000 living beings under its command. Most of them lived in that huge floating city. Most of the leaders of Qingyu Hall, including the God Kings and the God Kings, lived in the palaces around the city. In the hearts of the Hanya God Emperor's soldiers, that was the perfect place to cultivate. It was like a paradise. Staying in the city and palace of 7 Moon Mountain, even an ant or a sparrow would be born with the strength of a heavenly god. If they gained sentience, they could easily become a god lord after cultivating for a while. If they were a little smarter and more hardworking, they would have a high chance of becoming a god king. This was something that the tens of thousands of soldiers envied. When they were about to reach 7 Moon Mountain, the ice dragon and fire phoenix stopped in the sky. The 2 vice hall masters smiled and explained to the Hanya God Emperor, "The headquarters of our hall, 7 Moon Mountain, is up ahead. The city isn't big, and there are more than 200,000 people living there. It's already a little crowded. My lord, you have many soldiers in your fleet. I'm afraid it's not suitable for you to enter the city. You and your soldiers will be neglected." The other vice hall master also smiled and explained, "On the way back, we asked the hall master for permission. Your fleet can be stationed here. It's only 50,000 kilometers away from 7 Moon Mountain. It's neither near nor far. This way, the soldiers under your command will be freer and won't be neglected." Although the 2 vice hall masters were being polite and tactful, the Hanya God Emperor knew the truth. However, Pan Rua God Emperor knew that Pure Moon Hall was still on guard against her and would not allow her fleet to enter 7 Moon City. After all, that city was Qingyu Hall's base. If she commanded her fleet to attack, the entire city would be destroyed if the 2 sides fought. It was actually quite appropriate for the fleet to be stationed here and maintain a distance of 50,000 kilometers. Qingyu Hall could monitor her fleet, and there wouldn't be any conflict between the 2 sides. The Hanya God Emperor wasn't angry. She nodded to express her understanding. The 2 vice hall masters heaved a sigh of relief as if a heavy burden had been lifted from their shoulders. They continued, "However, please don't worry. The hall master has instructed that you and your subordinates can still enter Mount 7 Moons. The hall master will host a banquet for everyone. The fleet couldn't enter 7 Moon Mountain, but the Hanya God Emperor and her god generals could. There were only a few hundred of them. Even if they had evil intentions, their destructive power was limited. Qingyu Hall was confident that it could resist them. This was Qin Yu Hall's bottom line and attitude. The Hanya God Emperor sneered in her heart, but she didn't show it on her face. She nodded again to express her understanding. Thus, both sides reached a consensus. The Ice Dragon and Fire Phoenix carried the Qin Yu Hall's guards back to Seven Moon Mountain to report the news. The two Vice Hall Masters stayed behind to accompany the Hanya God Emperor. As for the Hanya God Emperor's fleet, they stayed where they were and camped. It was actually very simple to say that they were camped. More than 90,000 soldiers still stayed in more than 400 god warships. However, the god warships had to be arranged in a formation and hover in the sky. Moreover, many god generals had to work together to cast a spell and set up a defensive formation around the fleet in case of any accidents. In just 4 hours, the Hanya fleet finished setting up the defense and successfully camped there. Then, the Hanya God Emperor asked godly King Xia to accompany her and half of the god generals to visit the master of Qin Yu Hall on Seven Moon Mountain. 2 marshals and more than 200 god generals stayed in the fleet, maintaining vigilance in case of any accidents. Fortunately, Ji Tianxing had been named by Scarlet Afterglow. He was on the list to enter Seven Moons Mountain. He silently mixed in with the team and followed godly King Xia and the Hanya God Emperor to Seven Moon Mountain. Previously, he was worried that the Hanya God Emperor would notice something when he was only 1,000 feet away from the God Emperor. However, it turned out that his worries were unnecessary. After he broke through to the God Emperor realm, he had perfectly merged with the 5 elements world. He had already merged with heaven and earth, hiding all his aura and characteristics. Not to mention being 1,000 feet away from the Hanya God Emperor, even if he stood in front of the Hanya God Emperor, he wouldn't be seen through. Chapter 4439. When the Pan-God Emperor and his 200 or so divine generals flew toward the Seven Moons Mountain, the city had already received the news. In such a large city, the people had already received the news that a non-human guest had come to visit. They all walked out of their houses and gathered in groups to watch. A large number of divine king experts walked out of the palaces and buildings around the city. They were all curious and cautious as they sized up Ban Ruo Emperor God and the others. Outside the most majestic palace, over 100 godly kings stood in formation to welcome the arrival of the Pan-God Emperor's group. Although the two sides didn't speak the same language, the foreign godly kings bowed in unison. The smiles on their faces showed their enthusiasm and sincerity. The Pan-God Emperor and his soldiers returned the greeting. Then, under the guidance of 2 hall masters of the Clear Moon Hall, they walked into the main hall of the palace. Fortunately, the palace was large enough, and the reception hall was spacious. The Pan-God Emperor and his 200 or so divine generals, as well as the 100 godly kings from the Qin Yu Hall, still couldn't fill the hall. The two sides stood in 2 groups in the main hall. Only then did the master of Qin Yu Hall appear, escorted by several elders. The master of Qin Yu Hall was a middle-aged man. He was 20 feet tall and extremely muscular, like a walking bear. His skin was dark blue, and his bell-sized eyes were purplish-red. A rhinoceros horn protruded from his forehead, surrounded by purple lightning. Although the master of Qin Yu Hall's appearance was a little strange, it wasn't comical. He still exuded a domineering aura, and his expression was solemn. The Pan-God Emperor and his 200 or so divine generals greeted the master of Qin Yu Hall. Both sides bowed silently, speaking in a language that the other side couldn't understand. They both wore smiles on their faces. Ji Tianxing didn't stand out among the crowd as he silently observed his surroundings. He thought to himself that even if he cursed the master of Qin Yu Hall and the others, they wouldn't notice as long as he smiled, right? Of course, he wouldn't do something so pointless. Soon, the exchange of pleasantries ended. The Prajna God Emperor sat on the seat of honor on the left. Behind her, Xia God King stood in attendance. The master of Qin Yu Hall sat on the main throne and began to communicate with the Prajna God Emperor. As for the Prajna God Emperor's 200 heavenly generals, as well as the 100 elders and deacons of Qin Yu Hall, they were all waiting quietly in the main hall. No one knew what the Prajna God Emperor and the master of Qin Yu Hall were talking about. However, judging from their expressions and reactions, the conversation should be relatively smooth and pleasant. The Prajna God Emperor's expression was rather reserved, but it did not lose its elegance and politeness. The master of Qingyu Hall, on the other hand, always had a smile on her face. She did her best to show warmth, tolerance, and hospitality. She seemed very sincere. Ji Tianxing observed their expressions and guessed that the main content of their conversation was that the Prajna God Emperor wanted to know more about the Qingyu Hall. The master of Qingyu Hall wanted to rope in the Prajna God Emperor, so she invited the Prajna God Emperor to stay as a guest in the Qingyu Hall. If nothing unexpected happened, the master of Qingyu Hall would probably report this matter to the Kongming Temple, and the Kongming Temple would send a temple master-level expert to negotiate with the Prajna God Emperor. After all, the master of Qingyu Hall was only a peak divine king. He did not have the qualifications to speak with the Prajna God Emperor as an equal, so he could not promise anything. Only the Kongming Temple's temple master, who was also a God Emperor level expert, could negotiate with the Prajna God Emperor on an equal footing. Just like that, the Prajna God Emperor and the master of Qingyu Hall used their divine wills to communicate. They talked for 2 hours before ending. The final result could be considered satisfactory. Both of them had smiles on their faces. They should have reached a consensus. After the two sides bowed and said their goodbyes, the Prajna God Emperor led more than 200 divine generals and left the divine palace, returning to the fleet 100,000 li away. The master of Qingyu Hall led more than 100 divine kings to the plaza outside the main hall, watching the Prajna God Emperor and the others leave. Afterwards, he issued a few more orders. The various elders obeyed and went to carry out their tasks. One of the deputy hall masters led 20 deacons to collect a large number of scrolls and ancient books. They went to the Prajna God Emperor's fleet. At first, Ji Tianxing, like most people, did not understand the purpose of these people entering the Prajna God Emperor's fleet. It was not until the Prajna God Emperor gave the order to select 100 divine generals to communicate with the deacons of the Qingyu Hall that Ji Tianxing finally understood. Is the Qingyu Hall doing this to teach them the language and writing? That's right. It's not convenient to communicate with each other all the time through divine wills. The people of the Kongming Temple use the language and writing that is commonly used on the planet of origin. As long as the soldiers under the Prajna learn it, it will be easier for them to travel around the planet of origin in the future. Previously, Ji Tianxing had planned to find an opportunity to learn the language and writing used by the Qingyu Hall. At that time, his plan was to assassinate a deity king of the Qingyu Hall and refine his memories. It was simple, crude, and efficient. However, this method was risky and could easily backfire. If the Qingyu Hall found that their deity kings had mysteriously disappeared, they would definitely suspect the Prajna God Emperor's fleet and start a conflict. Although the conflict between the Prajna God Emperor and the Qingyu Hall was very beneficial to Ji Tianxing, the Qingyu Hall was not powerful enough. The Prajna God Emperor would not be so reckless. The Qingyu Hall was not powerful enough. Her fleet had just entered the planet of origin and would definitely not fight with the Qingyu Hall. They would definitely try to avoid it. Therefore, it was not the best time to provoke the two sides to fight. Ji Tianxing gave up the idea of assassinating the Qingyu Hall's deity king and stealing his memories. He volunteered to learn the language and writing taught by the deacons of the Qingyu Hall. Just like that, Ji Tianxing and hundreds of heavenly generals began to listen to the teachings of the deacons of the Qingyu Hall. Each deacon of the Qingyu Hall was responsible for teaching 5 heavenly generals. This was more efficient. The deputy hall master of the Qingyu Hall personally communicated with the Prajna God Emperor and taught her the language and writing of the planet of origin. Whether it was the heavenly generals or the Prajna God Emperor, they were all top experts in the world. There was no problem with their talent and comprehension. Even if they had to learn a new language and writing, they were able to do it easily. In just 5 days, the Prajna God Emperor and nearly 100 heavenly generals had learned the language and writing of the planet of origin. However, peerless geniuses like the Prajna God Emperor and Ji Tianxing had a clearer grasp of the language. Among the hundreds of heavenly generals, most of them could only be considered passable. Of course, even if their pronunciation was not very standard and their accent was a bit strange, It was not a problem for them to communicate normally with the deacons of the Qingyu Hall. After that, the 100 heavenly generals who had learned the language and writing of the planet of origin shouldered the task of teaching others and began to teach the many soldiers in the fleet. The Prajna God Emperor had mastered the language and writing of the planet of origin and began to read the books sent by the Qingyu Hall to learn about the history and various important events of the planet of origin. Ji Tianxing was also doing the same thing. Chapter 4440. Ordinary soldiers were not in a hurry to learn about planet of origin. They relied on God Emperor Pan Ruo, God King Qi Xia, and the others, so they only needed to follow orders. After all, they were the foundation of Pan God Emperor's power in this foreign world. They were the most loyal warriors and would not be abandoned. Fearless, the soldiers all had the mentality of following the arrangements and orders. But Pan Ruo God Emperor was different. Her heart was higher than the heavens. She would definitely not live under someone else's roof and be restricted and controlled by the Temple of Emptiness. However, this was her first time on planet of origin. She had to be humble and understand the power of the 4 temples and the situation on planet of origin. Only then could she make the most suitable and correct choice. After all, she had more than 90,000 soldiers following her. She had to find a way out. As for Ji Tianxing, his consideration was more long-term than Pan God Emperor's. Not only did he have to understand the situation of the 4 temples, he also had to predict what choice Pan God Emperor would make. Then he had to think of a plan to eliminate Pan God Emperor's power and deal with the other 4 God Emperors. And these plans had to avoid the 4 temples as much as possible. If the 4 temples were involved, the result would be hard to predict. After learning the language and writing of planet of origin, the hundreds of god generals were busy teaching the other soldiers. Only Ji Tianxing did not teach others. Instead, he focused on studying the books given by Qingyu Hall's deacons. Qi Xia Deity King noticed this and was curious about Ji Tianxing. She came to talk to him personally. Ji Tianxing had already thought of an excuse. He explained to Qi Xia Deity King, "The deacons of Qingyu Hall only taught us the most basic writing and language so that we can communicate smoothly. But this is far from enough. We still have to understand the history of this planet and the current power structure. They will not teach us these things. We can only find the answers in the books." Regardless of the race, history books are always one of the most important ways to pass down knowledge. Qi Xia Deity King also agreed with his point of view and felt that what he said was very reasonable. He couldn't help but nod and praise, "I didn't expect you to be so knowledgeable. Since that's the case, you don't have to teach the soldiers. Just follow me. I have a lot of things to deal with, so I don't have much time to study and read books. Once you've studied it thoroughly, report back to me." Unknowingly, Ji Tianxing had been promoted, and his power and status had increased. Being able to follow Crimson Afterglow and play the role of advisor meant that he would be able to come into contact with people like the Prajna God Emperor and the Master of Qingyu Hall. This would be more beneficial to his plans and actions, so he naturally agreed. In the following month, the soldiers of the entire fleet were in a state of learning, quickly grasping the words and language of the planet of origin. Ji Tianxing would read a large number of books every day, and at night, he would impart them to Crimson Afterglow God King. After reading a batch of books, Crimson Afterglow God King would ask the deacon of the Qingyu Hall for more books. As such, Ji Tianxing read more and learned more than anyone else. After a month, even the Prajna God Emperor's understanding of the planet of origin was not as deep as his. During this time, he spent every day with Crimson Afterglow God King as Feiyang Shenwang, acting very naturally. Even though he was Crimson Afterglow's trusted general in name, in their actual interactions, he was neither servile nor overbearing. In fact, in the process of imparting knowledge to Crimson Afterglow, he inadvertently revealed his unique insight and breadth of mind, which made Crimson Afterglow admire and praise him. After spending so much time together, Crimson Afterglow God King especially admired and valued him, even forgetting about each other's identities and interacting more like friends. Even though Feiyang Shenwang had an ordinary appearance, his strength and realm were ordinary. But the confidence, insight he revealed naturally had a unique temperament and charm, which made Crimson Afterglow respect him more and more. The other God King generals saw how Feyang Shenwang and Crimson Afterglow were inseparable every day, and were envious and jealous. Some God Kings even sowed discord, slandering and defaming Feyang Shenwang. But Crimson Afterglow did not care, and even punished those God Kings, believing that they had ulterior motives and were jealous of the virtuous. This matter did not blow up, only causing a small disturbance. When the Prajna God Emperor learned of this matter, he pretended to unintentionally find Crimson Afterglow for a discussion, to find out what was going on. At that time, Ji Tianxing and Crimson Afterglow were imparting knowledge to each other in the study. The two were sitting upright, with a desk in the middle, on which were basic ancient books. Ji Tianxing was teaching Crimson Afterglow. Crimson Afterglow listened attentively, looking at Ji Tianxing with a gentle gaze, filled with deep admiration. The Prajna God Emperor hid outside the door, purposely concealing his presence and aura, and secretly observed for a moment. Seeing Crimson Afterglow's reaction, and then looking at Feyang Shenwang's incessant narration of history, she suddenly had some feelings in her heart. Crimson Afterglow's nature is like this emperor's. He has always been proud and aloof, thinking highly of himself, and it is difficult for ordinary people to enter his eyes. She had been in charge of the Primal Chaos mainland for so many years, but there was never a military advisor or capable minister under her command. But now, here, she thinks highly of and admires Feyang Region Lord. That Feyang Region Lord is indeed a talent, just that he has been buried in the past. But, Crimson Afterglow, don't have any mortal thoughts? The Prajna God Emperor was the leader of 100,000 soldiers, an emperor-like existence. Even if she was worried that Crimson Afterglow would have any mortal thoughts about Feyang Shenwang, she would not be narrow-minded and destroy the harmonious relationship between the two. She pretended that nothing had happened, and quietly left Crimson Afterglow's study. Crimson Afterglow did not know anything about this, but Ji Tianxing, who was lecturing, was well aware. He did not reveal any abnormalities and continued to narrate to Crimson Afterglow. Up till now, the oldest god on the star of origin that can be traced back has a lifespan of 100,000 years. That expert's position is the most revered, and the four great temples are very respectful to him, calling him Old Ancestor. It is said that the Old Ancestor is not a native of the star of origin, but came from the god realm and entered this star 100,000 years ago. We all know that the star of origin is shrouded in the primal chaos fog, and one has to break through the fog to enter. Ever since the Old Ancestor broke through the fog, in the following 70,000 years, many experts have entered this star, and they have established the four great temples. Now, the living beings on the star of origin are roughly divided into two types. One type is outsiders like us, known as the Hong clan. The other type is the natives born on the star of origin. Some of them are spirits that evolved from the spiritual intelligence of all living beings. Although their appearance and bloodline are different, like different races, they are collectively known as the Desolate Race. Chapter 44-41. The billions of gods in the realm of the gods were roughly divided into the gods and other races. In fact, the gods were divided into hundreds of different races. All the races added up to more than 1,000. It was the same for the planet of origin. There were dozens of different races. The natives of the planet of origin were also divided into hundreds of different races. There was no practical use in differentiating them so meticulously. It was better to just differentiate between the natives and the primordial. There were many things to pay attention to. The reasons and origins were recorded in detail in the history books, but it was also very complicated. After Ji Tianxing finished reading the ancient text, he summarized it himself. Using the simplest language, he explained it to Crimson Afterglow. Xia understood immediately, but he did not delve into it. Instead, he was very interested in the numbers of 100,000 years and 70,000 years. Feyang Shenwang, you said that the oldest powerhouse on the planet of origin came from the realm of the gods and lived for more than 100,000 years? But isn't 100,000 years the lifespan of all living things? There has been a legend since ancient times. Even a peak god king could not live beyond 100,000 years. Ji Tianxing nodded and added, not only god kings, but even god emperors could not live for more than 100,000 years. This is the law of nature. And the ancestor of the planet of origin was said to have lived for more than 30,000 years before he entered the planet of origin. His current lifespan should be more than 133,000 years. Qi Xia's eyes lit up and he asked expectantly, so the ancestor broke through the limit and attained immortality? Ji Tianxing nodded and said, that's what the rumors say. Moreover, he's also the only powerhouse that's known to have obtained eternal life. Heavens! Crimson Afterglow was very shocked, but also very excited. So the planet of origin is really the origin of the universe. Here, one can attain immortality. As long as there was a chance of attaining immortality, even if the chances were slim, it was worth looking forward to. After a while, Qi Xia calmed down and asked, oh right, you said that the last batch of powerhouses to enter the planet of origin was 30,000 years ago. Since then, no one has come here? Ji Tianxing nodded and explained, until we appeared. Qi Xia frowned and muttered to himself, why is that? Is it because the realm of the gods and the dragon realm did not have a god emperor in those 30,000 years? Ji Tianxing had thought about this question and guessed the answer, but he could not tell Qi Xia. He could only nod in agreement. In fact, he guessed that the reason was that the War of the Gods 30,000 years ago had led to the fall of the realm and the elemental world of the gods and the dragon realm. The world of 5 elements had fallen to the lower realm, and the way of heaven was incomplete. This would definitely affect the planet of origin. What he needed to do was to investigate deeper and dig out more secrets. Qi Xia had also inherited the wisdom of the Prajna God Emperor. After pondering for a while, he said to Ji Tianxing, Feiyang Shenwang, fortunately you have read so many ancient books to understand the history and secrets. Otherwise, the Qin Yu Hall would not have told us. I'll leave this matter to you. You have to dig out more secrets. Don't worry, we will find a way to get you more ancient books. Ji Tianxing naturally agreed with Crimson Afterglow's suggestion. Then he continued to explain to Qi Xia, the planet of origin is very big. It is roughly 10 times the size of the realm of the gods. But there are no countries or continents here. Only the 4 great temples rule over everything. Each temple has dozens of halls. The area under the jurisdiction of each hall is equivalent to a region in the realm of the gods. Of course, the 4 great temples only occupy half of the planet of origin. The other half of the territory was unclaimed. In the future, if the Prajna God Emperor wants to establish his own temple, it would be best to choose from those unclaimed lands. Hearing this, Qi Xia frowned and glared at him sternly. He lowered his voice and scolded, Feiyang Sheng, how dare you talk nonsense about the God Emperor? We are the subordinates and subjects of the God Emperor. No matter what the God Emperor decides, we only need to follow his orders. Although Crimson Afterglow God King had become friends with him, but this kind of disrespectful words was still not something that could be said out loud. Ji Tianxing did not think much of it. He said calmly, what are you afraid of? You and I both know that with the nature of the God Emperor, he will not submit to others and be recruited by the Kongming Temple. Now, he is feigning civility with the Kongming Temple. He is just trying to find out the situation. Qi Xia Deity King glared at him again, then pretended to be angry and said coldly, so what if we know? How can you say such things? Don't you dare mention it again. Otherwise, if the God Emperor knows, he will punish you severely. Even I can't protect you. Although Qi Xia scolded Ji Tianxing sternly, it was obvious that she wanted to protect him. Ji Tianxing didn't want to continue the topic. He continued, I've read more than 800 ancient books in the past month and found that the history of the Star of Origin is actually very simple. The 4 ancient godly temples weren't hostile to each other. In this world where resources are abundant and everyone has the chance to live forever, it is very peaceful. There are very few wars and killings. The fairyland of the world, the land of peace and eternal life, is actually here. Therefore, when the experts of the Kongming Temple come to negotiate with the Prajna God Emperor, there may not be any conflicts. Only in places where resources are scarce, wealth is unequal, and power is not equal, there will be more conflicts, and wars. The star of origin is very special. Many of the creatures in this world are in a state where they have no desires. They do not need to cultivate. As they grow older, they can reach the Divine Lord realm and have a lifespan of more than 10,000 years. A slightly more diligent creature with a bit of understanding can become a divine king expert. Here, divinity is far more important than humanity. There are not so many schemes, and cruel vendettas. Therefore, Ji Tianxing knew that it would be very difficult to instigate a war between the Kongming Temple and the Prajna God Emperor. After hearing Ji Tianxing's words, Xianxia nodded thoughtfully. After a while, she announced the end of the day's study and asked Ji Tianxing to leave. She got up and went to find the Prajna God Emperor. She naturally had to tell the Prajna God Emperor what Ji Tianxing said to her. At the same time, she also had some ideas and wanted to give some suggestions to her master. But when she entered the Prajna God Emperor's ship, she met the 2 deputy hall masters of the Qingyu Hall outside the study. The 2 deputy hall masters were here to send a message. They were all smiles as they told Xianxia that the temple master of the Kongming Temple had arrived. Chapter 44-42. As expected, Qingyu Hall had reported the news to the Kongming Temple a month ago. To recruit the Prajna God Emperor and his fleet, the master of Qingyu Hall's identity and status was far from enough. Only the Kongming Temple's temple master had the right to do so. Of course, the Kongming Temple had several temple masters. Ji Tianxing, Xianxia Godly King, and the Prajna God Emperor had learned from the master of Qingyu Hall that the Kongming Temple had 5 temple masters. As for their titles, they were simple from the 1st to the 5th. First Temple Master, Second Temple Master, Third Temple Master, until the 5th Temple Master. The person who had come to 7 Moon Mountain to recruit the Prajna God Emperor and his fleet was the Second Temple Master. The First Temple Master was the most powerful person in the Kongming Temple. Of course, he was in charge of the temple and would not make a move easily. Sending the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Temple Masters to deal with this matter would show that they did not place enough importance on it. Therefore, the Second Temple Master was the most suitable person to recruit the Prajna God Emperor. It would also show the Kongming Temple's sincerity. The Second Temple Master did not come alone. He also came on a divine ship with 2 elders and 300 guards. There was no doubt that the 2 elders were peak godly kings and the 300 guards were all high-level godly kings. It was no exaggeration to say that godly kings were everywhere on the planet of origin and godly emperors were as common as dogs. Even the number of God Emperor experts could not be counted with 2 hands. At the very least, the 5 temple masters of the Kongming Temple were all God Emperor experts. The Second Temple Master's strength was also extraordinary. He had reached the middle level of God Emperor. The 2 Qingyu Hall Vice Temple Masters sent a message to the Prajna God Emperor. They said that the Second Temple Master was waiting in Qingyu Divine Palace and asked the Prajna God Emperor to meet him as soon as possible. This time, the 2 sides were meeting to discuss serious and important matters. Prajna God Emperor would not be able to bring hundreds of God generals with him to the Clear Moon Divine Palace. He would only bring a few trusted generals. As usual, the Crimson Afterglow Deity King followed her while the 2 marshals stayed behind to guard the fleet. Other than that, Prajna God Emperor ordered Xianxia Deity King to appoint 18 deity generals as guards. Feiyang Shenwang was now one of Godly King Xia's most trusted aides. Naturally, he was named to follow the Prajna God Emperor to the Clear Moon Divine Palace. When they arrived at Clear Moon Divine Palace, they were led by the 2 deputy hall masters of Clear Moon Divine Palace into the reception hall. Today, there were only about a dozen desolate race experts in the Grand Hall. It appeared a lot colder and quieter. The dozen or so experts were all important figures in Qingyu Hall. Apart from the 2 vice hall masters, there were also 2 guardians and 10 elders. Even the master of Qingyu Hall had to give up his throne and obediently stand beside the throne as a temporary guard. Naturally, the person sitting on the throne was the Kongming Temple's 2nd hall master. He was a slovenly old man with a head full of white hair and a long white beard. He was dressed in a silver-white robe. He was not from the desolate race, but the god race from the god world, which was the so-called flood race. The second hall master did not have the dignified aura of a superior. Instead, he had a relaxed, lazy, and amiable temperament. When he saw Prajna God Emperor, Xianxia Deity King, and the others, his eyes lit up. His body, which was leaning loosely on the throne, straightened up. Before the Prajna God Emperor and the others could greet him, the second hall master spoke with a thick god race accent. He laughed heartily and said, "Ha, that's great. I never thought that after 40,000 years, I would meet guests from my hometown again. This old man really didn't make this trip in vain." If he was a scheming and astute person, he would not be like the second hall master, greeting his fellow countrymen so enthusiastically. The Prajna God Emperor was stunned. Xianxia Deity King was also a little stunned. They turned to look at Ji Tianxing beside them. Ji Tianxing gave her a look, indicating for her to calm down. This should be normal. He had previously told Xianxia Deity King that the planet of origin was actually very peaceful. There were not many schemes and vendettas. For a god emperor like the second hall master, other than seeking immortality, he probably had no other desires. Therefore, the second hall master's reaction was an expression of his true feelings. There should not be any special meaning. Xianxia Deity King nodded in understanding. He quickly reminded the Prajna God Emperor with a voice transmission and explained. The Prajna God Emperor glanced at Ji Tianxing and did not say anything. He led the others to greet the second hall master. Prajna and her disciples greet the second hall master and senior. The title second hall master was for his status, while senior was a form of respect for his background. The second hall master quickly waved his hand, indicating for the Prajna God Emperor and the others to rise. After everyone was seated, the second hall master did not talk about the recruitment. Instead, he started a casual conversation with the Prajna God Emperor. "Prajna, previously the master of Qingyu Hall reported to me that there was a fleet that refused to be controlled by a temple and fled here in search of freedom. I thought you were from the desolate race of the planet of origin. I never expected you to be visitors from the heavenly realm." The Prajna God Emperor smiled awkwardly and explained, "Senior, please don't blame me. Previously, I lied out of caution and self-preservation. When I first entered the planet of origin, I did not know anything. Naturally, I did not dare to reveal my background." The second hall master waved his hand again, indicating that he did not mind. After all, when he first entered the planet of origin, he had the same thoughts and actions. Then, he asked again, "Ever since I entered the planet of origin, I have completely cut off contact with the heavenly realm. I don't know how things are over there. Of course, the planet of origin is the holy land and paradise of all cultivators. I have never thought of returning to the heavenly realm. I'm just worried about my disciples and grand-disciples. I wonder how they are doing in the heavenly realm? After 40,000 years, I wonder if my legacy is still around?" Emperor God used the power of a junior to force the second palace master into a stalemate and asked about his name and orthodoxy in the past. The second palace master spoke of his name and the name of the sect he had founded. Unfortunately, the Prajna God Emperor was confused and shook his head, indicating that he did not know anything. The second hall master frowned, feeling both pity and puzzled. At this time, Ji Tianxing stepped forward, cupped his hands, and said, "Second hall master, you may not know, but 30,000 years ago, there was an earth-shattering war between the gods in the heavenly realm. In that war, almost all the top experts in the heavenly realm were killed. In today's heavenly realm, the era before that war is called the Ancient Age. Many things about the Ancient Age have disappeared in the long river of history. Only a few ancient books have records of it. The mystic sky divine sect that you mentioned, I was fortunate enough to read about it in an ancient book. It was one of the 3 major divine sects in the Ancient Age. It once controlled the 2 continents, Vast Heaven and Vast Heaven. Unfortunately, in the war 30,000 years ago, the mystic sky divine sect was also involved in the war and eventually fell apart. Ji Tianxing was not lying about this. He had indeed read about it in an ancient book. However, when the second hall master heard that the mystic sky divine sect had fallen, his face was full of sorrow and his eyes dimmed. The Prajna god emperor frowned and turned to glare at Ji Tianxing. He was obviously angry. Book Guest House Reading Website. Chapter 44-43. Anyone could imagine how the second palace master would feel when he heard that his disciples and granddisciples had been annihilated and that his legacy had been destroyed. The pan-god emperor had never heard of the profound sky divine sect's deeds. Even if she had, she would not have told him the truth. After all, by not revealing the cruel answer, she could still give the second palace master something to think about. However, no one would have thought that Fiyang Shenmeng would stand up at this time and tell the second palace master the truth. Seeing the second palace master's pained expression and gloomy eyes, the pan-god emperor had a bad premonition. She somewhat hated Fiyang Shenwang for being so talkative. If not for the second palace master and the others being present, she would definitely have scolded Fiyang Shenwang. Wasn't this just deliberately causing trouble? It wasn't easy to meet the second palace master, who was also a member of the god race from the god realm. However, before the two sides could get closer, Fiyang Shenwang had spoiled the matter. Even the Crimson Dawn god king was shocked. She hurriedly turned her head to glare at Ji Tianxing and scolded him via voice transmission. "Shut up! How dare you speak nonsense when I didn't ask you to reply?" Little did she know that Ji Tianxing did not want the pan-god emperor to get too close to the Kongming temple. He was well aware that with the pan-god emperor's arrogance, she would not rely on the Kongming temple. However, this was only his guess. Perhaps the pan-god emperor had seen the Kongming temple's power and had made a connection with the second palace master and decided to join the Kongming temple. This possibility could not be ruled out. If that really happened, it would be too difficult for Ji Tianxing to get rid of the pan-god emperor's power and seek revenge on the pan-god emperor. Seeing the second palace master fall into reminiscence with a sorrowful expression, the pan-god emperor could not help but scold Ji Tianxing. "What are you still standing there for? Back off." Qi Xia celestial being saw that his master was angry, so he also scolded. "Region Lord Fei Yang, quickly step back. When you return, you will personally ask for forgiveness from the god emperor." Seeing that both the master and disciple were reprimanding Ji Tianxing, the second palace master collected his thoughts and waved his hand. "It's all right. This person was just telling the truth about what he knew." In fact, this old man had such thoughts and guesses long ago. Over the course of 40,000 years, the world had changed greatly. There was no such thing as an indestructible kingdom in this world, nor was there any power that would prosper forever. I've left the divine world long ago and settled down in the Star of Origin. I shouldn't care about the mundane affairs of the divine world anymore. It's this old man's state of mind that isn't strong enough, so I've been blinded. During the 40,000 years that the second palace master had spent on the Star of Origin, he had no other desires other than to seek immortality. As for the god realm, he would never be able to return. In that case, his disciples and granddisciples in the god realm, as well as the legacy he left behind, would no longer have much to do with him. It was just that he had suddenly met a visitor from his hometown, so he casually asked about it, wanting to resolve this knot in his heart. Unexpectedly, although the knot in his heart had been resolved, his hope had also been extinguished. After the second palace master collected his thoughts and calmed down, he started to talk about other topics with the pan-god emperor. Ji Tianxing retreated behind Qi Xia deity king and silently observed everyone's reactions. From the looks of it, the second palace master's state of mind was indeed quite open-minded. He quickly walked out of the haze and disappointment. He and the pan-god emperor chatted cheerfully and wittily, talking about many stories and rumors about the divine world. Through the second palace master's narration, everyone had a better understanding of the divine world during the ancient times. It was not an exaggeration to say that the divine world during the ancient times was truly filled with geniuses and experts. At that time, the cultivation of the divine path had also developed and multiplied to its peak. It was extremely prosperous and brilliant. It was a pity that the glory of the ancient times had ended during the great battle of the gods 30,000 years ago. Other than the past of the divine world, the second palace master also introduced the situation of the Star of Origin to the Pan-God Emperor. Just as Ji Tianxing had investigated from the ancient books and records, no one knew how many tens of thousands of years the Star of Origin had existed. So far, the oldest expert known on the Star of Origin was the Ancestor of Origin. The second palace master also admitted that the Ancestor of Origin's lifespan had exceeded 130,000 years. He should be the only expert who had obtained eternal life. Unfortunately, the Ancestor of Origin had already transcended the world and was not bound by any restrictions. He also did not join the four great temples. For tens of thousands of years, the Ancestor of Origin had almost never shown his face. No one knew where he was living in seclusion. The experts of the four great temples had also searched for the Ancestor of Origin's traces countless times to find the mystery of eternal life. The results were disappointing. The experts of the four great temples had only seen the Ancestor of Origin once, but they did not obtain any useful clues. In the end, the four great temples relied on their experience and accumulation, and spent tens of thousands of years to find some clues that pointed directly to the mystery of eternal life. To put it simply, the four great temples had roughly grasped the mystery of eternal life, but they could not implement it yet. The second palace master seemed to be chatting casually, but he mentioned this matter by chance. But the Pan-God Emperor was most concerned about this problem. Seeking eternal life was her greatest goal and dream. She was very interested in this matter and hurriedly asked the second palace master, what was the result? What was the mystery of eternal life that the four great temples had grasped? How could one obtain eternal life? Hearing the Pan-God Emperor's series of questions, the second palace master was not surprised. He only revealed an unfathomable smile. Pan-Rua, you are also an emperor-level expert. I think you know very well. To us, there is no need to be reluctant to leave anything in this world. Only the mystery of eternal life is our final pursuit. The four great temples spent tens of thousands of years, countless efforts, manpower, and material resources to find some clues. The mystery of eternal life is, of course, top secret. In the Kongming Temple, only the five of us know some inside information. Even the elders and protectors have no right to know. So, do you understand what I mean? The second palace master had spoken very bluntly. The mystery of eternal life was the top secret of the Kongming Temple. How could it be casually told to outsiders? Even the protectors and elders had no right to know. Only the palace masters had the right to know. In other words, with the Pan-God Emperor's strength, if she joined the Kongming Temple, she would most likely become the sixth palace master. At that time, she would have the right to know the inside information. The Pan-God Emperor was not stupid. She was very smart. She naturally understood the second palace master's meaning and immediately fell into silence and hesitation. In all fairness, she very much wanted to join the Kongming Temple and become the sixth palace master. Then she would know the mystery of eternal life. This was her greatest pursuit. Previously, she had joined forces with the other four God Emperor and spent thousands of years and efforts to continuously research the Star of Origin. This was also the reason. But she could not be reckless, and she could not make a decision on impulse. Not only was the fate of the 90,000 soldiers under her command in her hands, the other four God Emperor were also her most trusted allies. If she wanted to join the Kongming Temple, she had to first discuss with the four God Emperor. Chapter 44-44. The second palace master was also an extremely shrewd person. Seeing the Pan-Rua God Emperor remain silent, he guessed that she was hesitating about whether or not to enter the Kongming Temple. Since the Pan-Rua God Emperor did not directly refuse or find any reason or excuse, it meant that this matter was very promising. However, the Pan-Rua God Emperor still had some misgivings, so she could not immediately make a decision. The second palace master did not rush her and began to talk about the past of the four great temples, focusing on some of the people and matters of the Kongming Temple. He spoke at great length, and Ji Tianxing, Crimson Afterglow, and the others all listened to him. He did not delve into the details, but the core meaning was to express the powerful foundation of the Kongming Temple and its peaceful atmosphere. In any case, the four great temples were very harmonious and were not enemies, but more like partners. There was no war on the planet of origin, nor was there any hatred or conflict. The Pan-Rua God Emperor would only receive stability and generous conditions after joining the Kongming Temple with her over 90,000 soldiers. There would be no risk. In fact, their duty was only to follow the temple's orders, and they would not have to pay too great a price. The second palace master moved with emotion and reason, trying to persuade the Pan-Rua God Emperor in a roundabout way. He had come to Seven Moon Mountain this time specifically to deal with this matter, so he naturally hoped that the Pan-Rua God Emperor would give a reply as soon as possible. However, the Pan-Rua God Emperor finally decided to wait and see for a while after hearing his words. Before leaving, she cupped her fists and bowed to the second palace master, and said in a sincere tone, "Many thanks to the second palace master for clearing up this junior's doubts and allowing this junior to have a deeper understanding of the planet of origin and the four great temples. This junior understands senior's good intentions, and has indeed thought of joining the Kongming Temple. However, this matter is of great importance, and this junior cannot act arbitrarily. After all, the fate of the 100,000 soldiers is in this junior's hands. Senior, please wait patiently for a while, and allow this junior to carefully consider this matter." Seeing that she still could not make up her mind, the second palace master felt that it was a pity. However, he didn't say much. Maintaining his amiable smile, he nodded and said, "This matter is indeed of great importance. We can't be reckless and hasty. It's also good for you to discuss it with your subordinates. I'll give you half a month. I'll wait for you at Mount Seven Moons. When you have thought it through and can make a decision, you can come to Clear Moon Divine Palace to see this old man at any time." Prajna God Emperor once again cupped his fists to express his gratitude. Then he led Xia Godly King, Ji Tianxing, and the others away from the Divine Palace. On the way back to the fleet, the Prajna God Emperor's face was cold and indifferent, not saying a word. Crimson Afterglow and company didn't dare to say anything. They hurried on their way in silence. The atmosphere was a little gloomy. After returning to the fleet, Prajna God Emperor returned to the secret room of the flagship and contacted Lu Jiuyang, Dao Xingyun, and the others. She wanted to tell the four God Emperors everything she knew about the Star of Origin and the four holy temples. In addition, she also wanted to know the current situation of the four God Emperors and whether they had discovered anything. Finally, she wanted to discuss today's matter with the four God Emperors. No matter how amiable the second palace master appeared, he was still a fellow from the God realm. She didn't dare to trust him too much. Crimson Afterglow led Ji Tianxing back to the divine ship. The other divine generals and guards were dismissed. Ji Tianxing was left alone. Crimson Afterglow glared at him angrily and began to settle the score. "Feiyang Shenlong, do you admit to your crimes?" Ji Tianxing lowered his head slightly and cupped his fists in salute. He said calmly, "If my lord thinks that I am guilty, then I am guilty. However, after today's matter, I feel that not only am I not guilty, but I have also contributed." Crimson Afterglow was still thinking about how to punish Feiyang Shenlong. She wanted to punish him and appease her master without being too harsh. Even she didn't realize it. She didn't know when, but she had already regarded Feiyang Shenlong as a friend. This was because Feiyang Shenlong's temperament was too special. Even though he was her subordinate in name, he had never been servile or overbearing. The two of them had been together for a month. Her attitude had also changed imperceptibly. However, she didn't expect that Feiyang Shenlong would not only not admit to his crimes, but also say such words. She was stunned. Subconsciously she asked, "What? Not only are you not guilty, you have contributed? I want to hear how you are going to twist the truth and turn the facts upside down. Only then will you be able to turn your crimes into contributions." Ji Tianxing calmly explained, "You and I both know that the second palace master is here to recruit the Prajna God Emperor. Therefore, although he is in a high position, he acts amiable and approachable. He is a senior from the God realm. He used this opportunity to talk to the Prajna God Emperor about the God realms past for more than 2 hours. These are all basic methods to improve the relationship and win the trust of others. However, with his status and strength, he used these methods very cleverly. It was very convincing. Crimson Afterglow frowned. She asked coldly, "You mean, the Second Palace Master's amiability and closeness to the God Emperor are all fake?" Ji Tianxing nodded. He continued, "If even you think that this is his true nature and he is not pretending, then it means that he has succeeded in his disguise. Think about it. Your disciples and grand-disciples, the sect and orthodoxy that you created, were destroyed 10,000 years after you left. Wouldn't you be sad? You might even feel angry and want to get to the bottom of it. You might want to find out who destroyed your disciples and grand-disciples, right?" However, the Second Palace Master's expression only dimmed for a moment before it returned to normal. "Even a talkative person like me, who is about to be punished by the Prajna God Emperor, still has the heart to speak for me and help me out. Don't you think that this is too fake?" Crimson Afterglow squinted her eyes and stared at Ji Tianxing. She said in a low voice, "The Second Palace Master helped you out, but you slander him like this? Isn't this the behavior of a despicable person?" Ji Tianxing sneered. "I don't know the Second Palace Master, and I am just an insignificant pawn. Why would he care about me and help me out? There is only one answer. That is, if he wants to recruit us, he has to put on an act and put on a disguise." Crimson Afterglow gradually accepted his explanation, but she was still unwilling to believe it completely. She continued, "Even if the Second Palace Master's behavior is a little abnormal, even if he is, like you said, deliberately putting on an act to recruit us, there is no harm in it for us. After saying so much, are you going to reject the Second Palace Master's recruitment?" Ji Tianxing nodded and said, "Of course." The Second Palace Master described the Kongming Temple as incomparably powerful, but also very peaceful. "If we join the Kongming Temple, we will not have to pay any price, and we will be able to exchange for a very good environment and treatment. But if there are not enough benefits, why would the Kongming Temple do this? Don't blindly believe in the kindness and charity of others, and don't treat those God Emperor as saints. Although, I am still not sure what the Kongming Temple's intentions are, but I am sure that it is not something good." Chapter 44-45. Ji Tianxing's words caused Red Dawn God King to fall into hesitation and confusion. Although she didn't say much on the surface, she waved her hand to let Ji Tianxing leave. But she sat alone in the study and silently pondered for a long time. After an hour, she finally sorted out her thoughts and made up her mind. She got up and left the study to meet the Prajna God Emperor. At this time, the Prajna God Emperor was in the study of his residence, silently considering and weighing the pros and cons. In the previous 2 hours, she had contacted Azura, Yu Ming, Lu Jiuyang, and Dao Xingyun. Not only did she ask about the 4 God Emperors' recent situation, she also explained her own situation to them, as well as the Kongming Temple's recruitment of her. Although she was somewhat interested in joining the Kongming Temple, she still had to ask the 4 God Emperors' opinion before she could make a decision. After all, the 4 God Emperor were her most trusted allies. At present, everyone was scattered in various parts of the Star of Origin, far away from each other, and probably couldn't meet in a short period of time. But the Prajna God Emperor had to consider that when everyone met in a few years, they would most likely unite again to create a new force. Perhaps, the force created by the 5 of them together could contend against the 4 God Temples. If she didn't ask the 4 God Emperor's opinion and decided to join the Kongming Temple on her own, it was tantamount to betraying the 4 God Emperor. After Azura, Yu Ming, Lu Jiuyang, and Dao Xingyun received her message and found out about her current situation, they all replied to her message. Only Dao Xingyun was vague and said some ambiguous words, letting the Prajna God Emperor decide whether to join the Kongming Temple or not. The other 3 God Emperor had almost the same reaction, opposing the Prajna God Emperor's acceptance of the recruitment. Although the 3 God Emperor's words were different, the way they expressed themselves and the tone were also different. However, they all had the same idea. They could only trust each other and not the forces on the planet of origin, especially the 4 holy temples. No matter how amiable and sincere the people of the 4 great sacred halls looked, they could not be easily trusted. At present, the 4 god emperors were still exploring the planet of origin. Some of them had already found the natives of the planet of origin and made contact with the forces of the temples. However, there were 2 god emperors who were still fumbling about in the desolate and uninhabited areas, not even knowing where they were. Prajna God Emperor told the other god emperors what she knew about the Star of Origin and the 4 great temples. The 2 god emperors, who were in an uninhabited area, immediately came up with the idea of taking over the mountain and building a cave residence. In their opinion, since they were already on the planet of origin, they should settle down as soon as possible. With the abundant resources and cultivation environment of the planet of origin, the soldiers under their command could grow up quickly. Since the 4 great temples were peace-loving and wouldn't take the initiative to invade and oppress other forces, they could develop their forces in peace. The 2 god emperors had nearly 100,000 soldiers under their command, including both men and women. As long as they settled down on the planet of origin, the soldiers could reproduce and strengthen the army. The 2 god emperors who had this idea were the god emperor of the underworld and the Nine-Yang god emperor. The god emperor of the underworld was too arrogant and unwilling to submit to others. Even if he came into contact with the 4 great temples, he would not accept recruitment. As for the Nine-Yang god emperor, he had his own ideas and plans. Whether it was to meet up with the 4 allies or to join the 4 great temples, he was just a supporting role. It was better to stay in the no man's land and focus on cultivating the 100,000 soldiers under his command. At least he could make his own decisions. Dao Xingyun and the Shura god emperor had already come into contact with the powerhouses of the 2 temples. However, the Shura god emperor was cautious and shrewd by nature. He was still secretly observing and tracking the people of the temples. He had not met with them, let alone communicated with them. Originally, he wanted to find an opportunity to capture 1 or 2 natives and refine their souls and memories to understand the situation of the temples. Now, after listening to the Prajna God Emperor's introduction of the situation, he dispelled this idea. After all, the 4 great temples were too powerful. If he killed someone from one of the temples, they would most likely retaliate. The Shura God Emperor planned to hide the 100,000 soldiers and personally contact the people of the temples. Under the circumstances of peace and friendship, he would understand the power of the temples. Of course, it was impossible to join the temples. The situation of the 4 God Emperors was a little complicated, and each of them had some thoughts that they couldn't speak of. Wasn't the Prajna God Emperor the same? At least, she didn't tell the 4 God Emperors about the mystery of eternal life. If the 4 God Emperors knew that as long as she joined the Kongming Temple, she could become the Temple Master and obtain the mystery of eternal life. She didn't know what the 4 God Emperors would do or what they would do. After communicating with Azura and Netherworld, the Prajna God Emperor fell into deep thought, weighing the pros and cons and hesitating. Although we have been allies for the past 1,000 years, working together to study the chaotic fog of the Star of Origin. Moreover, I have always regarded the 4 of them as my brothers and have always respected them. But after coming to the Star of Origin, we have split up and encountered different opportunities. On the Star of Origin, we all have unlimited possibilities and the chance to obtain eternal life. Currently, I am 1 step ahead of them and understand the 4 great temples and the mystery of eternal life faster. Should I still abide by the agreement and look forward to meeting with them? The Prajna God Emperor muttered to himself, his eyes flickering. At this time, Crimson Dawn's voice sounded outside the study. Disciple Crimson Dawn requests an audience with Master. Crimson Dawn's voice interrupted the Prajna God Emperor's thoughts. She raised her hand and sent out a ray of divine light, opening the door to the study. Her voice was calm as she said, "Enter." Crimson Dawn pushed the door open and entered. After bowing to the Prajna God Emperor, he stood in front of the table. The Prajna God Emperor leaned back on the jade chair and took a sip from the teacup on the table. She asked slowly, "Crimson Dawn, are you here to report to Master? That Fiangsheng, how did you deal with him?" She had long seen that Feiyang Shenhuang was highly trusted and valued by Crimson Dawn. Even if Feiyang Shenhuang made a mistake, Crimson Dawn would take the initiative to punish him and then plead with her, protecting Feiyang Shenhuang in disguise. The Prajna God Emperor couldn't be bothered to pursue this matter. Crimson Dawn was her most beloved disciple. Of course, she wouldn't punish Feiyang Shenhuang for such a small matter and disappoint Crimson Dawn. The Prajna God Emperor had already thought it through. No matter how Crimson Dawn punished Feiyang Shenhuang, she wouldn't pursue this matter any further. This matter would just be a formality. But she never would have thought that Qi Xia Deity King would stammer as if he wanted to say something. The Prajna God Emperor frowned and asked in a low voice, "What? Based on your reaction, could it be you didn't punish him and are only here to plead with Master?" Having been seen through, Crimson Dawn could only brace himself and muster up the courage to say, "Master, Feiyang Shenhuang wasn't spouting nonsense, nor did he offend his superiors. He did this for your own good, to fulfill his duty." Chapter 44-46. The Pan God Emperor was taken aback by Qi Xia's words. She raised her eyebrows. Although she was angry, her lips curled into a meaningful smile. "Qi Xia, you are so protective of that Feiyang Shenhuang. You are even distorting the truth for him and personally pleading with me. Tell me, have you fallen in love with him?" "Master, there is no such thing." "Absolutely not." Qi Xia was embarrassed and anxious. She hurriedly waved her hands to deny it. The Pan God Emperor looked at her with a smile and said, "Good. Then I would like to hear how you will exonerate him." Qi Xia knew that her master had misunderstood, but this misunderstanding was difficult to resolve. She could only endure her shyness and speak her inner thoughts under her master's strange gaze. "Master, you should also know that Divine King Feiyang is your disciple's think tank. He does indeed have this talent, and his thoughts are meticulous and he has foresight. He has long seen that the Kongming Temple is eager to recruit us for some ulterior motive. Otherwise, why would the Kongming Temple treat us so sincerely and even promise us such generous conditions?" However, Feiyang Shenhuang's words carry little weight and he could not directly reprimand you. Therefore, he took the risk of overstepping his bounds in Clear Moon Divine Palace and said those words. His motive was to let you see how the second palace master would react. Hearing up to this point, Great Wisdom Emperor already understood what Crimson Cloud God King meant and asked back. Under normal circumstances, if the second palace master suddenly found out that his disciples and granddisciples had perished, and that the orthodoxy he personally created had been destroyed, he would definitely be heartbroken. In fact, the second palace master might even get angry because of this and ask who destroyed his orthodoxy and killed his disciples and granddisciples. However, he did not do so. He only felt pity for a moment before his emotions returned to normal. Moreover, when he saw that I was about to reprimand Feiyang Shenhuang in anger, the second palace master wanted to help him out. The Prajna God Emperor chuckled and said, "With the second palace master status, there's no need for him to do this, but he did." This meant that the second palace master was putting on an act. He was deliberately putting on a disguise to win our favor and make us join the Kongming Temple as soon as possible. Red Cloud, is that all you want to say? Qi Xia Deity King nodded in embarrassment and said, "Master's wisdom is indeed unparalleled. This disciple is impressed." Oh yes, Feiyang Shenhuang also understood this point. Therefore, he believes that Master should be able to understand after seeing Second Palace Master's reaction. The Prajna God Emperor looked at her deeply and said helplessly, "Forget it. Seeing that you care so much about Feiyang Shenhuang, this emperor won't pursue the matter. It's not a big deal anyway." Qi Xia Deity King's face lit up. He bowed and said sincerely, "This disciple thanks Master on behalf of Feiyang Shenhuang." Seeing that his disciple, who had always been arrogant and cold, had now become somewhat humane and even a little ignorant, the Prajna God Emperor smiled faintly. He felt an inexplicable emotion in his heart. In the past, in the God realm, there was mutual deception and vengeance everywhere. Qi Xia Deity King had to remain calm and cold in order to control the primal chaos mainland. Now that he was in the Star of Origin, it was peaceful and peaceful. There was no war or vengeance. Perhaps, she did not need to ask Qi Xia Deity King like before. Even if Qi Xia Deity King let down his guard and moved his mortal desires, she would not pursue the matter. The master and disciple fell into a short silence. Then, it was Qi Xia Deity King who took the initiative to ask, "Master, have you contacted the 4 God Emperors?" The Prajna God Emperor nodded. Qi Xia Deity King showed an expectant look and asked, "What did they say? Did they give you any suggestions?" The Prajna God Emperor showed a meaningful look and said in a low voice, "They naturally do not wish for this emperor to join the Kongming Temple. After all, this emperor is one step ahead of them and has already figured out the power structure of the Star of Origin. And they are still wandering around in the uninhabited areas, or have just come into contact with people from other temples." Qi Xia Deity King understood the meaning in his master's words. He lowered his voice and asked, "Master, do the 4 God Emperors all object to you joining the Kongming Temple? What are your plans? Are you not going to find the 4 God Emperors and meet up with them?" The Prajna God Emperor elegantly sipped his tea and said, "Of course they are opposed. Not only do they have ulterior motives, but this emperor is also holding back. There is no such thing as absolute loyalty in this world. It is only about how much benefit betrayal and breaking ties can bring. Coming to this new world, the origin of the universe, who does not want more opportunities to reach the peak and obtain eternal life? As for meeting up with them, it is not impossible, but we are scattered all over the Star of Origin. It will take at least a few years for us to meet up. The key question is, what is the point of meeting up? We are not being hunted down by the 4 temples. Why do we need to stay together and fight against the strong enemies? Since the Star of Origin is very safe, of course, we will rely on our own abilities to find opportunities." In front of his most trusted disciple, the Prajna God Emperor did not hold back and spoke from the bottom of his heart. Qi Xia Deity King panicked and asked anxiously, "Master, you mean you are going to agree with the 2nd Temple Master and join the Kongming Temple?" The Prajna God Emperor nodded and said, "Do not forget, we have spent 1,000 years of effort, sparing no expense to explore the Star of Origin. What is it for? It is to pursue the path of eternal life. What is the use of meeting up with the 4 God Emperors and forming an alliance? The resources on the Star of Origin are inexhaustible, and there is no killing or war. Moreover, the 4 temples have spent tens of thousands of years of effort to find the mystery of eternal life. After I meet up with the 4 God Emperors and form an alliance, won't it also take me tens of thousands of years to find out the mystery of eternal life? If so, don't say that I am not willing to form an alliance. I am afraid that they will make the decision faster than me and join the 4 temples." This Qi Xia Deity King was stunned, not knowing how to persuade or refute her master. After hesitating for a moment, she squeezed out a sentence, "But Master, are you really not worried that the 2nd Temple Master has ulterior motives and that the Kongming Temple wants to use us?" The Prajna God Emperor nodded and said, "Of course, I have considered these problems. Therefore, I will not make a decision so easily and hastily. Of course, I will continue to discuss with the 2nd Temple Master. At least, I will find out the real reason why the Kongming Temple is so eager to recruit us. Even if the Kongming Temple wants to use us, I will also find out what value we have. If we are used by the Kongming Temple, will the advantages outweigh the disadvantages, or will the disadvantages outweigh the advantages?" Qi Xia Deity King was still unwilling and wanted to persuade a few more words. But the Prajna God Emperor waved his hand and said, "Qi Xia, you don't need to say any more. I already have a plan, you can leave now. All right, take good care of your confidant. I can let it go this time, but if he dares to offend me again, I will not let him off easily." Chapter 44-47. Since the Prajna God Emperor had already made up her mind, Qi Xia had nothing more to say. She bowed and left. But when she went back, she was a bit disappointed and worried. If it was before, she would have trusted her master. No matter what decision her master made, she would have supported her without hesitation. and she would have had hope and expectations. But now, after spending a month with Fei-yang Shenwang, she had been imperceptibly influenced by him, and her views and thoughts had changed. She couldn't help but worry. If the Kongming Temple had ulterior motives, her master's decision would be too risky. The fate and future of more than 90,000 soldiers were in her master's hands. Nothing could go wrong. Just like that, Xia returned to her warship with a belly full of worry. Ji Tianxing was still waiting for her in the study. When he saw her return, he took the initiative to ask, what was the result? Did the Prajna God Emperor make her decision? Xia looked at him and nodded. She walked to the table and sat down. She picked up a teacup and silently drank tea. Ji Tianxing saw her reaction and guessed that the result was not satisfactory. He asked, did your persuasion not work? Did the Prajna God Emperor stubbornly insist on joining the Kongming Temple? In Xia's view, given the intelligence of Fei-yang Shenwang, it was not surprising that she could guess this result. It was completely normal. She nodded, her eyes dim. Even you and I can see that there is something wrong with that second palace master. The Kongming Temple is definitely plotting something. Master should also be able to see it, but she has her own thoughts and plans. Once she has made up her mind, she will not easily change it. Ji Tianxing naturally did not want to see the Prajna God Emperor rely on the Kongming Temple. If that happened, how could he take revenge? No matter what, he had to make sure this matter was messed up before he could be at ease. He continued to ask, logically speaking, before the Prajna God Emperor made her decision, she would definitely discuss it with the other four God Emperor. Could it be that the other four God Emperor agreed to her joining the Kongming Temple? Haven't you tried to persuade her? Xia Deity King nodded and said, of course, I've spoken to the 4 God Emperors and 3 God Emperors objected to it. Only the Star Cloud God Emperor was vague about it. However, Shizhuan had his own ideas and plans. He kept some secrets and did not tell the 4 God Emperors. Ji Tianxing guessed that the secret kept by the Prajna God Emperor should be the mystery of eternal life that the second palace master had mentioned. Moreover, the Prajna God Emperor clearly knew that the Kongming Temple was plotting something, yet he still wanted to join. Most likely, he was attracted by the mystery of eternal life. If it weren't for the mystery of eternal life, the Prajna God Emperor could have occupied a mountain and declared himself king, establishing his own sect. Unfortunately, the mystery of eternal life was in the hands of the 4 great temples. To get the answer to the mystery, he had to compromise with the 4 great temples. Ji Tianxing frowned and thought for a moment before asking. The Prajna God Emperor clearly knows that joining the Kongming Temple is no different from asking a tiger for its skin. Why is he still so stubborn? You must know that it's not just you and me, but also the lives and fates of more than 90,000 soldiers are in his hands. Xia Deity King glanced at him and said in a low voice, Fei-yang Shenwang, pay attention to your status. Don't criticize the Prajna God Emperor. Even if you have some intelligence and wisdom, you will always be Shizhuan's subordinate. You must not do anything that oversteps your authority and say anything that crosses the line. Obviously, Xia Deity King did not intend to persuade the Prajna God Emperor anymore and accepted this result. Ji Tianxing knew that this matter was a foregone conclusion and could not be changed. He could only think of another way. He began to comfort Xia Deity King. Forget it. Since the Prajna God Emperor has made up her mind, we just need to follow her orders. I believe that she will not be too rash and will definitely negotiate with the second palace master and clarify the conditions. Xia Deity King warned him again and again not to speak carelessly in the future. Otherwise, if the Prajna God Emperor punished him again, she would not be able to plead for mercy. Ji Tianxing naturally agreed. He cupped his hands and bowed to Xia Deity King before leaving the study. For the next half a month, Mount Seven Moons was peaceful. The second palace master fulfilled his promise and stayed in Clear Moon Divine Palace. At the same time, he patiently waited for the Prajna God Emperor's reply and did not disturb her again. The Prajna God Emperor stayed in the fleet and almost never showed her face. No one knew what she was doing. Maybe she was weighing the pros and cons, thinking about the follow-up plan, preparing for joining the Kongming Temple or the failure of negotiations. Or maybe she was adapting to the resources and divine power of heaven and earth on the planet of origin and was cultivating in seclusion in a secret room. In short, she did not show her face in front of the soldiers. She only gave an order when the 15-day deadline was about to end. That order was for all the soldiers to be alert, and ready to listen to orders at any time. The Prajna God Emperor did not explicitly say what she wanted the soldiers to prepare for. But the soldiers all understood that the 15-day deadline for the Prajna God Emperor to negotiate with the Kongming Temple was coming to an end. Soon, the Prajna God Emperor would have to make a choice whether to join the Kongming Temple or not. If the negotiation went smoothly and the relationship between the two sides was harmonious, then it would be fine. If the negotiation between the two sides broke down, then it would be easy for conflicts to arise. Then the soldiers would have to be prepared in advance. In the event of an emergency, the soldiers would be able to evacuate at the fastest speed after receiving the order. Anyway, the planet of origin was big enough. As long as they escaped from the Kongming Temple's sphere of influence, the fleet could find a place with spirit veins and settle down. Understanding the Prajna God Emperor's intention, the many soldiers prepared for battle and entered a state of high alert. Finally, the 15-day deadline was over. On the morning of the 16th day, the Prajna God Emperor left the fleet and brought Xia God King and the 18 God Generals to the Clear Moon Divine Palace to negotiate with the second Palace Master. To Ji Tianxing's disappointment, he had wanted to go with Xia God King and personally witness the negotiation process. At least, he would be able to understand the key points and results of the negotiation. But Xia God King was afraid that he would spout nonsense again and say something inappropriate, which would make the Prajna God Emperor angry. If this happened again, she would not be able to protect Ji Tianxing. Therefore, she rejected Ji Tianxing's request and asked him to stay in the fleet's camp. Ji Tianxing could only stay in the fleet because of his identity. He also thought of secretly following the Prajna God Emperor and the others and sneaking into the Clear Moon Divine Palace to listen in. But after serious consideration, he felt that this was too risky. He was confident that he could hide from the Prajna God Emperor, but he was not confident that he could hide from the second Palace Master. After all, the second Palace Master was not an ordinary God Emperor. Previously, when he was chatting with the Prajna God Emperor, they had talked about the differences in the realms of God Emperor. On the planet of origin, the 4 great holy temples seemed to have only 4 realms of God Emperor. The first was the initial realm, the second was the middle realm, and the third was the upper realm. Most of the God Emperors were at the initial realm, but the second Palace Master had already reached the middle realm. The Grand Palace Masters of the 4 great holy temples were basically at the upper realm of God Emperor. And the primordial Lord of Heaven, who had already attained immortality, was the only one at the eternal realm. Chapter 44-48. The Pan-Rua God Emperor was also very interested in the division of God Emperor realms. When she and the second Palace Master had talked about this, she had asked him to get to the bottom of it. After the second Palace Master's explanation, everyone understood the difference between the 4 realms of God Emperor. The key was the amount of Dao aura. Those who could condense 1 to 3 Dao auras were at the initial stage of God Emperor. Those who could condense 4 to 6 Dao auras were at the middle stage of God Emperor. Those who could condense 7 to 9 Dao auras were at the upper stage of God Emperor. And those who could condense 9 Dao auras and attain eternal life were only the primordial Lord of Heaven and Earth. The second Palace Master's explanation confirmed Ji Tianxing's initial guess. The strength of God Emperor was indeed differentiated by the amount of Dao auras. This also made everyone understand that the second Palace Master had condensed at least 4 Dao auras. Ji Tianxing had only condensed 1 Dao aura and did not know the difference between his own strength and the second Palace Master's. He could only give up on the idea of following the Pan-Rua God Emperor to listen to the discussion. He stayed in the fleet and waited patiently for news. On the other side, the Pan-Rua God Emperor brought Xia Supreme Being and the others into the Clear Moon Divine Palace. The second Palace Master did not put on airs. He was already waiting in the meeting hall with the Master of Qingyu Hall and the Guardian Elders. The two sides met and exchanged greetings before the Pan-Rua god emperor took his seat. The second palace master was still kind and amiable. He smiled and asked the Pan-Rua god emperor, "Pan-Rua, I did not disturb you in the past half a month. I believe you have discussed with your trusted god generals and come to a conclusion, right? The godly hall is very busy. While I was away, there was a backlog of government affairs. If possible, I hope you can give me an answer today so that I can return with peace of mind." Although the second palace master had expressed that the Pan-Rua god emperor had to give him an answer today. However, his tone and demeanor did not seem aggressive. The Prajna god emperor had long guessed this would happen and had made his preparations. He replied methodically, "Senior, please be at ease. This junior is also extremely sincere and has already discussed this with my subordinates. I definitely won't purposely stall for time. In fact, this junior has already asked for the opinions of the generals under my command, and I can basically confirm the answer. However, the younger generation and the soldiers are somewhat slow-witted. There is always a question in their hearts that they can't figure out. If this problem is not cleared up and left unresolved, I'm afraid I can't promise you anything." The Prajna god emperor didn't beat around the bush and went straight to the point. The second palace master was startled. He was both happy and worried. "Hanya, if that's the case, as long as this old man can solve that question, you will be able to give the answer and lead the soldiers to join this palace?" "Indeed." The Prajna god emperor nodded, his tone solemn. "Goodness. As long as I can tell you, this old man will definitely answer." The second palace master already had a premonition and could roughly guess what the Prajna god emperor would ask. However, he was very bold and decisively agreed to this condition. The Prajna god emperor struck while the iron was hot and hurriedly asked, "The star of origin is very peaceful, and the cultivation resources are abundant. The environment is excellent. There are no conflicts or wars between the four great temples, and naturally, there is no need to rope in other powers to expand their forces and fighting strength. Since this is the case, why is the Kongming Temple so sincere in inviting this junior to join the temple? This junior believes that the Kongming Temple will not do meaningless things, and even more so, will not help us for no reason. There must be some reason, or we have some value and use that is worth the Kongming Temple doing this. I ask Senior to be frank and clear this junior's doubts." The Prajna god emperor's words were rather direct, making the second palace master frown. The amiable smile on his face dissipated. Originally, he wanted to give a long speech describing how the Kongming Temple was benevolent and how it had helped countless members of the desolate race, bringing them under the temple's wing and providing them with protection. However, he could tell that the Prajna god emperor would not believe such hypocritical words. They were all god emperor experts, and the Prajna god emperor was definitely one of the overlords of the heavenly realm. He was definitely not that easy to fool. If he did not tell the real reason, the Prajna god emperor would definitely not agree to join the Kongming Temple. After deliberating for a moment, the second palace master said earnestly, "Prajna, since you do not believe in my benevolence and benevolence, nor do you believe in our goodwill, then this old man will not beat around the bush with you. I'll be direct with you. That's right. The reason why I took the initiative to recruit you is because I have a motive. However, this motive is not a bad thing, nor will it endanger your interests and safety. On the contrary, this is not only beneficial to me, it is also extremely beneficial to you and the soldiers under you." The Prajna god emperor remained unmoved. He looked calmly at the second palace master, waiting for him to continue. The second palace master sighed as a wry smile appeared on his lips. He explained, "To be honest, we have always been searching for the person of destiny. For this, we have not hesitated to travel mountains and rivers to search all living beings in the territory. We have checked the qualifications and bloodlines of every talented person. No one knows what kind of person the person of destiny is, or what kind of race they are. Perhaps they are among the people of the temple, or perhaps they are among you and the soldiers under you. In short, I need to take you in, nurture and observe you, and choose the most outstanding genius among you. Other than that, I have no other requests for you. As you know, the four great temples coexist peacefully, without any conflicts or killing. There is no lack of cultivation resources on the planet of origin. What do you think I can use you for? The Prajna God Emperor had also thought about this question, but after thinking about it over and over again, he really could not think of what the Kongming Temple could use them for. The person of destiny? The second palace master's explanation made her believe a little, and some doubts and guesses appeared in her mind. What is the person of destiny? Is it related to the mystery of eternal life? If the Kongming Temple finds the person of destiny, how will they deal with it? The second palace master nodded and said, "This is a top secret, and I can only tell you because you are sincere in wanting to join me. Yes, the person of destiny is indeed related to the mystery of eternal life. I have spent a lot of effort to find the person of destiny. If I find him, I will do my best to nurture and protect him. I can promise you that as long as you and the soldiers under you are loyal to me and do not do anything that will harm my interests, I will not harm you." At this point, even if the Prajna God Emperor's doubts had not been completely dispelled, he could not say anything more. The second palace master had already told her the two secrets of the person of destiny and the mystery of eternal life. It could be said that he had done his utmost benevolence. The Prajna God Emperor nodded, and after pondering for a moment he finally made up his mind. He bowed to the second palace master and said in a solemn tone, "Many thanks to the second palace master for clearing my doubts. Since the Kongming Temple is so sincere, this junior is willing to join the Kongming Temple with the 98,000 soldiers under my command." Chapter 44-49. The Prajna God Emperor had finally decided to join the Kongming Temple. When she announced her decision, the second palace master smiled kindly and gratified. The Hall Master of Pure Moon, the Vice Hall Masters, the Elders, and the Protectors of Dharma all looked relieved, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from their shoulders. They had worked so hard for so long, and they had finally received results. The Prajna God Emperor had brought more than 90,000 soldiers to join the Kongming Temple, and they had a part to play. When the Kongming Temple had successfully incorporated the Prajna God Emperor's fleet, they would definitely be rewarded accordingly. Although the planet of origin was full of divine power and cultivation resources, the most common cultivation resources were the most common. However, the most common cultivation resources were at the God Lord level. God King level resources were rarer. Even more precious were the supreme grade cultivation resources, which were usually hidden in certain secret realms or dangerous mountains and rivers. Even with the influence of Qing Yu Hall, it was difficult to find treasures and cultivation resources of that level. The treasures that the Kongming Temple used to reward its branches were all supreme grade treasures. It was said that above supreme grade treasures were emperor grade treasures and cultivation resources. They were all rare treasures that had been created by the heavens and the earth. They were treasures that Qing Yu Hall did not dare to hope for. Only the Kongming Temple had the ability to obtain such treasures. Only those who had made outstanding contributions and made earth-shattering contributions would be rewarded with emperor-level treasures. The Qing Yu Hall had successfully helped the second palace master recruit the Prajna God Emperor's fleet. The merit could be big or small. If nothing unexpected happened, the Kongming Temple would definitely reward the Qing Yu Hall with a large amount of emperor-grade treasures. If a peerless genius, or even a person of destiny, appeared in the Prajna God Emperor's fleet, then the Kongming Temple would definitely reward the Qing Yu Hall with emperor-grade treasures. Of course, the master of Qing Yu Hall and the others could only think about it. They did not dare to hold out too much hope. The second palace master looked at the Prajna God Emperor with a kind smile. He stroked his beard and said, "Prajna, in the future, you will be glad that you made the right decision today. The 90,000 soldiers under your command will also have the most stable and comfortable cultivation environment. They will also be grateful for your wise decision. On behalf of all the people of the Kongming Temple, I would like to express the most sincere welcome to you and your soldiers." The Kongming Temple would definitely hold a grand ceremony to welcome the Prajna God Emperor. But that was a matter for a few months later. Right now, the second palace master could only use this method to welcome Pan Rua Emperor God. The matter had been settled. The second palace master and the Prajna. Prajna, the first palace master said Kongming Temple, Prajna. But tomorrow, you will come with me to the temple's headquarters and meet with the temple masters in person. At that time, we will discuss how to settle you and your subordinates. The Prajna god emperor had long been mentally prepared for this. She also knew that she didn't bring her soldiers to join the Kongming Divine Temple just for words or to reach an agreement. She definitely had to go to the Kongming Temple's headquarters and meet with the temple masters. She might even have to make some sort of oath. After all, she was also a god emperor. After joining the Kongming Temple, she was very likely to be the sixth temple master. The grander the Kongming Temple treated this matter, the more important it was to her. On the other hand, if the second palace master made a verbal agreement with her and the matter was over, she would feel that it was not reliable. On this matter, I will follow the second palace master's orders. I hope that the second palace master will take care of me in the future. The Prajna god emperor bowed to the second palace master and smiled in agreement. However, we will be leaving tomorrow. Time is a bit tight. I hope that the second palace master can give me one more day to arrange my soldiers. The second palace master thought for a moment. Since the matter was going smoothly, one more day was not a big deal. Thus, he readily nodded in agreement. That's fine too. Then this old man will wait for you for one more day. This round trip to the temple's headquarters will take at least 2 months. The soldiers under your command can either stay where they are or move into Seven Moon Mountain. In any case, we will be a family in the future. The Qingyu Hall will definitely make the proper arrangements for your soldiers. The Prajna god emperor thought for a moment and waved her hand. Thank you for your kind intentions, senior. This junior has too many soldiers. If we rashly enter the Seven Moons Mountain, it will cause trouble for the master of Qingyu Hall and the others. There is no need for them to move. Just staying where they are is fine. The second palace master would not insist on this matter. He nodded and said, You can decide for yourself. In any case, you will follow this old man to the temple's headquarters. After the matter is settled, you will definitely be assigned a territory to form a new branch. The second palace master knew that as long as nothing unexpected happened, the Prajna god emperor would definitely become the sixth palace master of the Kongming Temple. The 90,000 soldiers under the Prajna god emperor's command were all from the god realm and the various galaxies. To the planet of origin, these 90,000 soldiers were the foreign flood tribe. The Prajna god emperor did not wish for his soldiers to be scattered and placed in different branches. The Kongming Temple would not do so either. The most suitable result was to arrange for the 90,000 soldiers to be placed in a territory to act as a new branch. However, it was a bit of a stretch to form a branch with such a small number of people. But as time passed, the 90,000 soldiers would have to reproduce and their numbers would slowly increase. The second palace master had already thought it through. When he returned to the headquarters with the Prajna god emperor, he would persuade the Prajna god emperor to think of a way to expand the population. Allowing the soldiers to reproduce was only one of the methods. If the Prajna god emperor could discover more natives of the planet of origin and recruit them, it would also be a way to quickly expand the population and influence. Of course, this was all for later. The Prajna god emperor bowed to the second palace master and left the Seven Moons Mountain with godly King Crimson Dawn and the others. After returning to the fleet, the Prajna god emperor summoned several hundred divine generals and gathered them in the main hall of the flagship to announce a piece of news. In truth, all of the soldiers had been waiting for the result. Seeing the expressions of the Prajna god emperor, godly King Crimson Dawn, and the others, they could guess the answer. Ji Tianxing stood in the crowd, calmly looking at the Prajna god emperor. When he heard her announce that she had joined the Kongming Temple, he frowned imperceptibly. He had thought that he understood the Prajna god emperor well enough, but he hadn't expected things to develop in a direction he didn't want to see. Fortunately, the Prajna god emperor had ignored the objections of the other 4 god emperors and insisted on joining the Kongming Temple. This also proved that the alliance between her and the other 4 god emperors wasn't that strong. This might be a good thing for Ji Tianxing. At the very least, he would be able to take down the 5 god emperors one by one. Afterward, the Prajna God Emperor issued another order for the soldiers to remain where they were and wait patiently for news. She would take godly King Crimson Dawn and follow the second palace master to the Kongming Temple's headquarters. She estimated that they would return in 2 months. During this time, the soldiers were not allowed to interact too much with the Qingyu Hall to avoid any accidents. When he heard this news, Ji Tianxing's eyes flashed, and a thought popped into his mind. Chapter 4450. The fact that the Prajna God Emperor had led her soldiers to join the Kongming Temple was an unchangeable fact. The only thing Ji Tianxing could do now was to destroy the relationship between the two sides and prevent this from happening. If the Prajna God Emperor stayed in the fleet, even if the second Hallmaster returned to the Kongming Temple headquarters, it would be difficult for him to find an opportunity to attack. After all, the Seven Moon Mountain was 100,000 miles away from the fleet, and there were countless god kings in the Qingyu Hall. However, Ji Tianxing heard that the Prajna God Emperor was going to leave with God King Xia for 2 months. Of course, this was good news for him. The second Hallmaster, who was the biggest threat to him, would definitely return to the Kongming Temple headquarters. If the Prajna God Emperor left the fleet, then her fleet and Qingyu Hall would have no God Emperor to oversee them, and Ji Tianxing could do whatever he wanted. Next, Xianxia God Emperor announced a series of orders in front of everyone, giving the 2 marshals and the various divine generals various missions. God King Xia was going to follow her to the Kongming Temple headquarters, so only the 2 marshals were left to guard the fleet. The Prajna God Emperor's orders and missions were intended to adjust the personnel of the various god warships so that the soldiers could peacefully stay in the fleet and cultivate for the next 2 months. She repeatedly emphasized that the soldiers should stay in the fleet and not go out as they pleased, and they should not have any conflicts with the people of the Qingyu Hall. She would return in 2 months, and the Kongming Temple would definitely distribute land to the soldiers. After the meeting, the god generals left to carry out their missions. The Prajna God Emperor also left the meeting hall and returned to the study with God King Xia and the 2 marshals. Ji Tianxing waited patiently and secretly observed the personnel movements of the various god warships, silently memorizing them. Before the Prajna God Emperor left, he wouldn't do anything out of line. Even so, before Crimson Dawn God King left with Prajna God Emperor, he sought him out alone and repeatedly warned him not to cause any trouble. Clearly, Crimson Afterglow understood his temperament and was worried that he would cause trouble. That was why he warned him in such a serious tone. Ji Tianxing naturally agreed and did not show any signs of resistance. On the morning of the 3rd day, Prajna God Emperor brought Crimson Afterglow to Seven Moon Mountain to meet up with the second Hall Master. The second palace master took Ban Ruo, Xia, and his guards and left Seven Moon Mountain on a divine ship. The master of Qingyu Hall, the vice hall masters, the elders, and the protectors all saluted him in the sky. After a short while, when the second palace master's flagship disappeared into the horizon, the crowd returned to their residences. Seven Moon Mountain returned to peace. The citizens of Qingyu Hall returned to their normal lives and did what they were supposed to do. 100,000 li away, the Prajna fleet also fell into silence. All of the soldiers stayed in the god warships and cultivated in peace. Of course, Prajna God Emperor had previously warned the soldiers not to let down their guard completely. Every god warship had several dozen soldiers to take on the task of protecting it. This was extremely necessary. Even though Prajna God Emperor had joined the Kongming Temple, he couldn't completely trust the Kongming Temple. He still had to remain vigilant. Even the 2 marshals guarding the fleet were cultivating in seclusion while the other remained vigilant. Ji Tianxing remained in Crimson Dawn God King's flagship, assuming the role of the guard leader. The soldiers all knew that he had a close relationship with Crimson Dawn God King and was deeply trusted and valued. In Crimson Dawn God King's absence, he was able to give orders and had a lot of authority. Of course, even though his identity was a little special, under the current circumstances, he still had to obey the orders of the 2 marshals. Prajna God Emperor had clearly announced that after she and Crimson Dawn God King left, all authority would be in the hands of the 2 marshals. In the first few days, Ji Tianxing didn't show the slightest bit of abnormality. He was in charge of more than 30 soldiers guarding Crimson Dawn God King's flagship. He basically never left the god worship. On the surface, it looked like he was meditating and cultivating, occasionally walking around the god worship. But in reality, he was constantly monitoring the situation of the entire fleet. In these few days, there was nothing unusual about the fleet. Not only the guards of the god worships, but even the two marshals had let down their guard. 5 days later, Ji Tianxing expanded his range of activities. He would occasionally leave the god worship and wander around the fleet. He would enter the various god worships under various pretenses to check the distribution of personnel and the situation of the defenses. Marshals would noticed his abnormality and sternly questioned him about what he was doing. Ji Tianxing had already thought of an excuse. He replied calmly that he had encountered a bottleneck in his cultivation and wanted to learn from the god generals. This excuse was very reasonable. He was a 6th-tier divine king. After coming to the planet of origin, his strength had increased exponentially. He had reached the peak and was about to break through to the 7th tier. He was only one step away from becoming a high deity king, and he would be able to reach a higher level. Therefore, it was understandable that he was eager to break through to the next level. Marshals couldn't stop him. He could only let him visit the various god worships. Another 10 days passed. Ji Tianxing visited more than 400 god worships and discussed their cultivation experiences with each of the god generals. In this way, everyone knew that he was about to break through to the upper divine king level. Therefore, he expanded his range of activities. He left the fleet and went to various mountains and forests to search for cultivation resources. Of course, this was not allowed. Before the Prajna god emperor left, he had repeatedly ordered that no one was allowed to leave the fleet without permission. Marshals found Ji Tianxing again and reiterated the Prajna god emperor's order. He forbade him from leaving the fleet. However, Ji Tianxing said that he was at the critical moment of breaking through to the upper divine king level. However, he didn't have the necessary cultivation resources or elixirs. Anyway, the planet of origin was full of cultivation resources. There were all kinds of treasures around the fleet. If Marshals didn't allow him to collect them, he could only ask Marshals for them. If it were any other god generals, Marshals wouldn't agree and would even scold them. However, Ji Tianxing's identity was special. He was the brains of Qi Xia deity king. Marshals didn't want to offend Qi Xia deity king, but he also didn't want to pay for it. He could tacitly allow Ji Tianxing to collect resources and treasures, but he repeatedly warned Ji Tianxing not to go near the 7 Moon Mountain. Ji Tianxing naturally agreed and kept his promise. He didn't go near the 7 Moon Mountain. However, Marshals neglected one thing. The soldiers of the Prajna fleet wouldn't go out without permission. However, the people of Qinyu Hall returned to normal and moved around as usual. Every day, many people left the 7 Moon Mountain and went to the surrounding mountains and rivers to search for mines and treasures. As a result, Ji Tianxing soon met the people of Qinyu Hall in the mountains hundreds of thousands of miles away. He wanted to stir up conflict between the two sides, so he started to act. In order to confuse the others, he opened the battleship and summoned dozens of his followers to search for resources and treasures with him. On the surface, they were searching for treasures, but in reality, their target was the people of Qinyu Hall. Chapter 4451. It was difficult for both sides to maintain peace, but it was easy to start a fight. A small team of Pure Moon Hall consisted of more than 20 people in the King of God realm. They were mining ores in a mountain range. It was a mid-king level ore that could be refined into high-quality godly gold and gems. It was one of the most commonly used cultivation resources of Qinyu Hall. There were many ores in the mountain range, which were worth more than 10 trillion godly stones. Once all the ores were mined, it would be enough for hundreds of thousands of living beings to cultivate for decades. As soon as the team from Qinyu Hall started mining, Ji Tianxing arrived with more than 50 followers. A month ago, after Ji Tianxing learned the language of the planet of origin, he made many jade slips and distributed them to his friends and followers for them to learn. Therefore, the 50 or so followers under his command had long learned the language of the planet of origin. When they arrived near the oars, without needing Ji Tianxing to give the order, the 50 followers drew their swords and surrounded the people from Qingyu Hall. The people from Qingyu Hall were naive. They probably hadn't experienced something like this in a long time, so they didn't know what was going on. They stopped mining and looked at Ji Tianxing and the others in confusion. The leader of the deacons was an upper-level god king. He quickly greeted Ji Tianxing and asked for the purpose of his visit. "Brother, if I remember correctly, you are a divine general under the command of the Prajna God Emperor, right? I think I've seen you before at Mount Seven Moons. Brother, why have you brought so many soldiers and surrounded us with swords and swords?" Hearing the deacon's words, Ji Tianxing's followers laughed. Perhaps the deacon had never been beaten by society, or perhaps he couldn't believe that the soldiers under the command of the Prajna God Emperor would cause trouble for them. Both sides had been getting along well, and the Prajna God Emperor had also decided to join the Kongming Temple. They were going to be a family in the future. How could this happen? The deacon thought that the planet of origin had always been peaceful, and they had never experienced fighting for resources. There must be some misunderstanding. To his surprise, Ji Tianxing said righteously, "The ores you are mining have been marked by us a long time ago. We were the first to discover it. Without our permission, you mine the ores without permission. That is invasion and plunder." Ah! The deacon was stunned. He didn't expect the other party to say something so shameless. The god kings around him were still looking left and right, trying to find the mark Ji Tianxing had mentioned. One of the young and impetuous god kings retorted in a very unconvinced manner, "Sir, you are twisting words and distorting the truth. As early as a year ago, we had already mined here. You've only been here for less than 2 months. So what if you've made a mark? We were the first to discover it." Ji Tianxing had expected the other party to say this. He sneered and said, "So you are bullying us because we came late? Is the area around Mount Seven Moons your territory? All the products and resources are yours, and we can't touch a single leaf?" Theoretically speaking, that was indeed the case. The area around Mount Seven Moons was Qingyu Hall's territory to begin with. However, the people of Qingyu Hall couldn't admit to Ji Tianxing's words. It would make them seem too domineering. Seeing that more than 20 people of Qingyu Hall didn't say anything, Ji Tianxing said with disappointment, "When the second hallmaster was still here, Qingyu Hall acted so cordially. We believed you then and thought you were so welcoming. We didn't expect that it was all a disguise. You are actually so narrow-minded, hiding a knife behind a smile. Despicable and shameless." The people of Qingyu Hall were dumbfounded. They stared at Ji Tianxing with their mouths agape. They didn't expect Ji Tianxing to spout so many resentful words over such a small matter. He even used words like hiding a knife behind a smile and despicable and shameless. This was too much of an exaggeration, wasn't it? Seeing that Ji Tianxing was going to continue harping on Qingyu Hall's attitude, the 20 people of Qingyu Hall were terrified. The leader of the deacons was afraid that if Ji Tianxing continued, the relationship between Qingyu Hall and the Prajna God Emperor would become even more strained. If that really happened, the master of Qingyu Hall would punish him severely without having to report it to the second hallmaster. After all, Qingyu Hall had spent a lot of effort to recruit the Prajna God Emperor's fleet. If something went wrong at this time, he would be the main culprit. He would have to bear the consequences. Therefore, the deacon had no choice but to make a prompt decision. He bowed to Ji Tianxing and said, "I'm really sorry for causing you to misunderstand our hall. The Prajna God Emperor and his soldiers have already joined the Kongming Temple. In the future, we will all be one family. We should be united and friendly. Since you want this mine, we will give it to you and find another place. I hope that you can clear up the misunderstanding and stop saying things that will hurt our trust and feelings." After he finished speaking, the deacon waved his hand and led the 20 people out of the underground mine. Although the 20 or so people were somewhat unwilling, they still secretly complained about the deacon. Why did he take the initiative to give in? Even if the other party was the Prajna God Emperor's subordinate, he couldn't be so unreasonable, right? However, the deacon gave the order and led the crowd away quickly. Only then did he patiently explain to the crowd. When the crowd understood that this was a serious matter and that they had to endure, they could only give in. After the people of Qingyu Hall left, Ji Tianxing sent out Yang and his 50 or so followers to excavate the mine as quickly as possible. Yang had the innate ability to excavate and refine mines. The amount of work he completed alone was equivalent to that of a few hundred people. Originally, the huge mine in the mountain range would take at least half a month to completely excavate. Unexpectedly, under Yang's leadership, the crowd only needed 2 days to finish the job. Not only did they excavate the mine, but Yang also refined the ore into divine gold and gemstones. Ji Tianxing put away the divine gold and gemstones and distributed a batch of cultivation resources to the crowd. Then, he had them return to the warship to recuperate. After that, he returned to the fleet. In less than a day, the fleet spread the news. Many soldiers heard that Feiyang Shenwang had wandered around outside and easily found a mine. Not only did he obtain a large amount of mid-king level divine gold, but he also obtained a high king level pearl. Many of the soldiers on his warship could testify to this. After all, those soldiers had seen many treasures with their own eyes and received rewards from Feiyang Shenwang. After the news spread, the soldiers on the various warships discussed this matter. Many of them were very tempted. However, when the divine generals went to Feiyang Shenwang to ask about the situation, they learned that Feiyang Shenwang was already in seclusion. Chapter 44-52. Even though Qi Xia Deity King and his soldiers had taken a terrifying amount of resources with them when they left the divine world, the two marshals had led tens of thousands of soldiers under the command of the Prajna God Emperor. They had been busy studying the chaotic fog on the Star of Origin and had accumulated immeasurable wealth. However, no matter how many treasures and riches the fleet had, they were still under the control of the Prajna God Emperor and Qi Xia Deity King. Normally, the 90,000 soldiers could only receive their salaries on time and the number was strictly controlled. As a result, when the soldiers arrived on the Star of Origin, they were bathed in abundant divine energy and constantly gained new insights. They could increase their strength and cultivation levels at any time. Unfortunately, they did not have enough resources to cultivate and could only rely on meditation and absorbing the divine energy of heaven and earth to increase their cultivation levels. If they had enough resources and treasures, they would be able to increase their strength by leaps and bounds in the shortest time possible. It was for this reason that the soldiers on the various divine warships were envious and jealous when they heard that Feiyang Shenwang had found treasures. Many of the divine generals had the same idea. They wanted to ask Feiyang Shenwang where the treasures were. Unfortunately, Feiyang Shenwang was in seclusion. It was said that he was going to break through to the 7th level of the Divine King realm. Therefore, the divine generals could only wait patiently. Of course, the divine generals and their soldiers were also secretly discussing how they could leave the fleet and go out to search for treasures. Feiyang Shenwang's identity was special. The two marshals did not dare to make things difficult for him. Even when they knew that he had left the fleet, the two marshals turned a blind eye to it. However, the other divine generals were different. They did not dare to openly disobey the orders of the Prajna God Emperor. If the two marshals found out, they would be severely punished. Soon 3 days had passed. What excited the soldiers was that Feiyang Shenwang had come out of seclusion. With the abundant resources and treasures he had obtained, he had broken through to the 7th level of the Divine King realm and become a high-level Divine King. From that moment on, his status had risen to another level. Many of the soldiers found it hard to believe. They could not believe that Feiyang Shenwang could break through in 3 days. Under normal circumstances, anyone who could break through to the 7th level of the Divine King realm in 3 years would be considered a super genius. 3 days? It was like a myth. However, many divine generals had seen Feiyang Shenwang with their own eyes and could tell that he had made a breakthrough. No matter how ridiculous this matter was, the truth was right in front of them. They had no choice but to believe it. Some immortal generals knew Feiyang Shenwang and were on good terms with him. They would privately ask him how he managed to break through so quickly. Ji Tianxing did not try to hide anything. He generously told everyone that it was the batch of resources and treasures that he had obtained earlier that allowed him to make this contribution. He also told everyone about what he had seen and heard when he was wandering around. He saw all kinds of rare treasures and precious resources everywhere. When the god generals heard this, they were all salivating and abnormally tempted. Therefore, the divine generals offered to follow Ji Tianxing to explore the surroundings in search of resources and treasures. There was nothing they could do about it. All of them desperately wanted to obtain sufficient cultivation resources so that they could quickly break through their realms and increase their strength. Ji Tianxing expressed that he was in a difficult position. After all, the Prajna God Emperor had given the order that they could not leave the fleet without permission. The immortal generals cursed in their hearts. Since you know that the God Emperor has given the order, aren't you still going out to search for treasures? However, they could not say this out loud. Therefore, they begged Ji Tianxing to think of a way to help them and their soldiers. Ji Tianxing could not resist their coaxing and pestering. He could only reluctantly say that his words carried little weight. Even if he personally interceded, the two marshals would not agree. Unless the immortal generals banded together and went with him to Marshallswa to express their wishes and their urgent need for cultivation resources. They believed that Marshallswa would be reasonable and might agree to let them leave the fleet. When the immortal generals heard this, they felt that this method was feasible. Therefore, they spontaneously persuaded the other immortal generals to join the ranks of the treasure hunters. The immortal generals who were not familiar with Feiyang Shenhuang were worried that they would not be able to find a way. Since someone had come to invite them, they would gladly accept. Soon, another 8 immortal generals agreed to join forces and join the operation. Ji Tianxing brought 15 immortal generals to Marshallswa to plead. When Marshallswa heard that so many people were leaving the fleet to search for treasures outside, he flew into a rage and reprimanded them. However, the immortal generals still had the mentality that the law could not punish the majority and argued with Marshallswa. After all, the Prajna God Emperor had already left for the headquarters of the Kongming Temple and would not return for 2 months. Although the God Emperor had given the order that they were not allowed to go out, they lacked cultivation resources. However, everyone lacked cultivation resources and was waiting for a large number of resources and treasures to increase their strength and realm. Otherwise, they would have to waste 2 months of their time and waste the good environment and resources on the planet of origin. Moreover, they were only going out to gather resources and search for treasures. They would not go near the 7 Moon Mountain and would not cause any trouble. As long as marshals would turn a blind eye and allowed them to go out and gather resources. 2 months later, when the Prajna God Emperor returned to the fleet, a large number of soldiers would break through to the next realm and give the God Emperor a surprise. Under the persuasion and pleading of the immortal generals, Marshallswa wavered. After that, Ji Tianxing promised him that they would only go out to gather resources and would not go near the 7 Moon Mountain. After much consideration, Marshallswa had no choice but to agree to their request. The immortal generals were overjoyed and bowed to Marshallswa to express their gratitude. After bidding farewell to Marshallswa, the immortal generals went to gather their trusted soldiers and prepare to go out with Ji Tianxing. However, the news was leaked and more immortal generals learned about it. They went to Marshallswa to plead for mercy and also wanted to go out to gather resources. Marshallswa felt a headache coming on. He regretted setting a precedent. However, he could not be biased and could only agree to their request. In order to not cause chaos and cause trouble, he set a rule for the immortal generals. Only 15 immortal generals could go out with Feiyang Shenhuang at a time. Moreover, they had to listen to the orders of Feiyang Shenhuang when gathering resources outside. Marshallswa did this because he did not want to bear the responsibility alone. If the immortal generals caused trouble outside, he could push the blame to Feiyang Shenhuang. After all, Feiyang Shenhuang was the one who started it and had a close relationship with Wuxia Shenhuang. It was only right for him to take the blame. Thus, the matter was settled. After the first batch of 15 immortal generals and 300 soldiers were gathered, they left the fleet with Ji Tianxing to gather resources. Thus, it was time for Ji Tianxing to put on an act again. He led the 320 soldiers and flew to the south. Along the way, they found many natural treasures and resources and gave them to the soldiers. The soldiers were overjoyed and in high spirits after receiving the resources and treasures. Ji Tianxing seemed to be looking for more resources and treasures, but in fact, he was looking for the people of Qingyu Hall. Chapter 44-53. Unknowingly, 2 days passed. In order to make it easier for the heavenly generals to gather cultivation resources and obtain treasures, Ji Tianxing split them into 2 groups. The 8 heavenly generals led 160 soldiers and flew towards the mountains in the southeast to search for treasures. Ji Tianxing led 7 heavenly generals and 140 soldiers towards the mountains in the southwest. Along the way, the heavenly generals and soldiers wanted to stop and gather any treasures or resources they saw. However, Ji Tianxing stopped them and explained to them, "Don't be limited by the resources and treasures before you. I'll bring all of you to a place. I've already scouted it a few days ago. There's a spirit vein and treasures there, and it's filled with treasures. When you get there, you can have as many treasures as you want. Why do you still need to gather treasures along the way?" When the heavenly generals heard this, they were immediately interested and filled with anticipation. They quickly followed Ji Tianxing and sped up. Not long after, they flew 300,000 miles and arrived at the land with spiritual veins. Ji Tianxing didn't lie to them. There were indeed heavenly treasures everywhere in the spirit vein treasure land. There were even rare mineral veins in the depths of the earth. The 7 heavenly generals and 140 soldiers all rushed over in ecstasy. They gathered resources as fast as they could and plundered the heavenly materials and earthly treasures. However, they were only focused on gathering the resources and treasures, so they neglected the people who were digging the mineral veins underground. Without a doubt, the 50 desolate race people who were digging the mineral veins underground were Qingyu Hall's citizens. They had been sent out 7 days ago to gather the mineral veins and god stones. The 50 God King Realm citizens were led by 2 high-level God King Realm wardens. One of the wardens had led more than 20 citizens a few days ago to gather the mineral veins in a mountain not far away. Unexpectedly, a heavenly general under the Prajna God Emperor suddenly arrived with dozens of God Kings from the desolate race. He insisted that they were the ones who discovered the mineral veins first. That deacon argued strongly, but the other party used Qingyu Hall as an excuse to bully others and described Qingyu Hall as despicable, shameless, treacherous, and cunning. The deacon didn't want the matter to escalate and affect the relationship between the 2 sides, so he could only swallow his anger and give up the mine. He had thought that the matter was over. He met up with another deacon, and the 2 of them led 50 people to another place with a spirit vein and began to excavate a new mine. However, he did not expect that after 2 days of mining, a large group of Flood Tribe members would appear and rush over to snatch the resources without saying a word. Furthermore, there were more than 140 Flood Tribe members who had come to snatch the resources. Like tigers and wolves, they quickly harvested all the precious herbs and divine items on the ground, completely ignoring the existence of the people of Qingyu Hall. The 50 Qingyu Hall citizens were dumbfounded. They stared at the desolate tribe members with their mouths agape. After a while, everyone finally came to their senses. A few of the people who had already been hurt once cursed angrily. "It's the Prajna God Emperor's soldiers again. Why are they acting like bandits? How despicable! They just took one of our mines a few days ago, and now they're here to snatch our spirit vein? They came over to snatch it without saying a word. Last time, there were more than 50 of them. Today, there are more than 100 of them. These bastards have gone too far. They've tried to snatch our mines again and again. What are they trying to do?" That's right. Everyone knows that the area around 7 Moon Mountain is Qingyu Hall's territory. We've already given them a lot of leeway by allowing them to mine the resources around here. There are cultivation resources and treasures everywhere, but they're still trying to snatch our things. They're here to pick a fight. Hearing the citizens' curses, the rest of the people realized that this was not the first time the Flood Tribe had done something evil. Moreover, the Flood Tribe was deliberately trying to snatch the spirit vein from them. Everyone was filled with righteous indignation. They flew out of the underground and hovered above the spirit vein. The people of Pure Moon Hall, who had suddenly appeared, looked down at the many officers and soldiers in a condescending manner, looking furious. The soldiers who were frantically harvesting resources and treasures were also stunned. They stopped harvesting and turned to look at the citizens of Qingyu Hall. The two sides faced each other silently. The atmosphere was a little strange. One side was furious, while the other side was confused and looked at each other. At this moment, one of the citizens of Qingyu Hall spoke first. He shouted angrily at the soldiers, "You shameless bastards! There are resources and treasures everywhere, but you don't want to mine them. Instead, you want to snatch our spirit vein. You've gone too far." Since someone had taken the lead to denounce Ji Tianxing and the others, more citizens of Qingyu Hall stood up and shouted angrily. "Bastards! The area within 100 million miles of Mount Seven Moons is Qingyu Hall's territory. We've already taken good care of you by allowing you to be stationed here and mine for resources. I didn't expect you to be so arrogant and domineering. You're using the power of the Prajna God Emperor to humiliate us. This is intolerable. We've already given in, but you're still chasing us down and jabbering on. We're not done with this." More than 100 soldiers were scolded by the citizens of Qingyu Hall. They were baffled and felt very wronged. Seeing that the citizens of Qingyu Hall were getting more and more agitated and scolding, some of the soldiers finally couldn't take it anymore and started to fight back. "Are you crazy? When have we ever humiliated you? Of course we know that the area around Mount Seven Moons is your territory. But you said that we'll be a family in the future and should help each other and take care of each other. Now it seems that you're all hypocrites. You're purposely putting on a show in front of the second hall master. We found this vein a few days ago. We just came here to collect it today. How is it a robbery? Do you think that you can bully us as you wish just because the Prajna God Emperor has left? You're the ones who are being arrogant and domineering." The 7 godly generals and 140 soldiers brought here by Ji Tianxing didn't know what had happened before. Therefore, they felt wronged and angry when they were scolded by the citizens of Qingyu Hall. Even though the deacon of Qingyu Hall recognized Ji Tianxing, he pointed at him and scolded angrily, "Sir, you've gone too far. Are you trying to start a conflict between the two families by robbing our veins again and again?" However, Ji Tianxing didn't think much of it and said, "I found this vein a few days ago and made preparations to mine it. That's why I went back to the fleet to gather people. If Qingyu Hall is still so arrogant and doesn't allow us to collect any resources, then we have nothing to say. Why don't we send a message to the second hall master now and let him make the decision?" Chapter 44-54. Ji Tianxing spoke in a righteous and confident manner, which made the 100 soldiers even more confident. However, the people of Qingyu Hall began to murmur among themselves and began to think of retreating. After all, they all knew that the second palace master had personally traveled to Seven Moon Mountain and spent so much time to recruit the Prajna God Emperor. If they angered the Prajna God Emperor because of this and caused the God Emperor to go back on his word, the second palace master would definitely punish the people of Seven Moon Mountain severely. This was especially true for the culprits. They would definitely face an extremely tragic end. For a moment, the 50 citizens of Qingyu Hall were in a dilemma. They were hesitant. Seeing their reaction, the 7 divine generals and more than 100 soldiers became even more confident and valiant. "Ha! Are you speechless? Weren't you very arrogant just now? Hypocritical and cunning fellows, if you know what's good for you, you'd better get out of here. Weren't you very generous and enthusiastic earlier? Since Seven Moon Mountain is surrounded by treasures of heaven and earth, you should find another place. This land of treasures with spirit veins is ours." The hesitation of the citizens of Qingyu Hall fueled the soldiers' arrogance. The ground full of treasures of heaven and earth, as well as the rare mineral veins underground, strongly stimulated the soldiers' nerves, causing their greed to reach its peak. At this moment, the soldiers were so excited that they had long forgotten the order the Prajna God Emperor had given them before he left. As for the citizens of Qingyu Hall, they were already full of grievances and indignation. When they saw the other party flaunting their strength, they were even more furious. Many of the citizens could not hold back their anger. They took out their divine weapons and swords, wanting to punish Ji Tianxing's soldiers. These citizens of Qingyu Hall had never experienced war or vengeance. Even when they took out their Kenshin weapons, they only wanted to vent their anger and teach the other party a lesson. However, the soldiers Ji Tianxing had brought with him were mostly from the Divine World and other major galaxies. These were all elites who had crawled out from mountains of corpses and seas of blood. Which one of them had not gone through hundreds of battles and killed more than 10,000 enemies? In their eyes, the fact that the other party dared to bring out the Kenshin soldiers meant that they wanted to fight to the death. They thought that they were in the right and had the advantage, so how could they admit defeat? Have the bastards from Qingyu Hall finally shown their true colors? You can't outtalk us and you're in the wrong, so you want to kill us. Don't think that we're afraid of you just because you're all divine kings. At most, we'll just fight it out and see whose life is tougher. You want to fight? Then don't blame us for being rude. Both sides roared and clamored, their anger and killing intent soaring. Even though the two deacons of Qingyu Hall kept reminding the people that they should not fight unless it was absolutely necessary, they still didn't dare to do so. The 7 divine kings and more than 100 soldiers also remembered marshals was warning that they should not cause trouble. However, the situation was getting more and more tense. In the midst of the raging atmosphere, no one could remain rational and clear-headed. Finally, 2 of the Qingyu Hall citizens could not hold back their anger. They waved their swords and sabers and attacked the arrogant soldiers in front of them. Since the sabers and swords flashed and the dazzling divine light, which carried surging divine power, shone on the soldiers, the rest of the people did not sit back and do nothing. Therefore, dozens of soldiers attacked at the same time. The Kenshin soldiers brandished their swords and used their ultimate divine powers to attack the Qingyu Hall citizens. The divine powers of both sides collided with each other, and there was a loud rumbling sound. Fragments of divine light flew all over the sky. The huge commotion caused the surrounding thousands of miles to tremble. In the sky full of godly light fragments and flying dust, several godly generals shouted at their soldiers, telling them to restrain themselves and retreat quickly away from the battlefield. The 2 deacons of Qingyu Hall were also anxiously berating their soldiers and ordering them to stop. Unfortunately, both sides had already started fighting, and both sides had suffered casualties. Who could hold back their anger and stop? Another round of divine light danced in the air, and loud noises shook the sky. This time, not only were more than 20 soldiers injured, but even 3 divine kings of Qingyu Hall citizens were severely injured and vomiting blood. Although many of the soldiers were divine sovereigns, they had the most number of people. Ji Tianxing wanted to make a big deal out of this, so he secretly used some dirty tricks. Of course, the divine kings of Qingyu Hall citizens could not withstand his attacks. The 2 deacons of Qingyu Hall were extremely anxious when they saw that the battle between both sides was about to escalate. They repeatedly ordered their soldiers to retreat. On Ji Tianxing's side, he was also yelling on the surface, ordering the soldiers to retreat and not to attack again. However, when the 50 citizens of Qingyu Hall were about to leave the battlefield, Ji Tianxing secretly added fuel to the fire. He increased the divine powers of the 2 divine generals by 10-fold. As a result, with a loud bang, the 3 people of the Pure Moon Hall were swept away by the divine light, which was much more powerful than before. They were smashed into pieces and killed on the spot. Although both sides had clashed and killed each other, it was still fine if they were only injured and did not die. However, it was different now. 3 Qingyu Hall citizens were killed. This time, the situation was completely out of control. Ji Tianxing's soldiers stopped fighting. They looked at the citizens of Qingyu Hall with complicated expressions. Some of them were excited and elated. Some of them were secretly regretting their actions. They were worried that they would be severely punished by Marshal Zhou if they made a big deal out of this. The citizens of Qingyu Hall were extremely sad and indignant. However, they were also very helpless. Their hearts were filled with hatred and killing intent. They could not accept the other party's shamelessness, arrogance, and cruelty. They were also heartbroken over the deaths of their comrades. However, they had to take the overall situation into consideration and not let the conflict between both sides escalate into a war. They could only swallow their anger for now. They could only give up on this precious land of spirit veins. They supported the injured and flew away. Before they left, the two deacons shouted angrily, "We will remember what happened today. Just you wait. You killed our citizens. We will not let this matter rest. Qingyu Hall treated you with sincerity, but you killed our fellow citizens. Our patience is limited. You must pay the price." After saying these harsh words, the people of Qingyu Hall quickly left and returned to Mount Seven Moons to heal their wounds. They also wanted to report the entire incident to the master of Qingyu Hall. They wanted to ask the master of Qingyu Hall to make a judgment and seek justice for the dead. Of the 140 soldiers under Ji Tianxing's command, more than 10 of them had died in the battle. More than 30 of them had suffered minor or serious injuries. After the people of Qingyu Hall left, the people gradually regained their senses. They were also filled with grief and indignation. Damn it! It was obviously the people of Qingyu Hall who started the fight. Now they want to frame us. Just because 3 of their men died, they acted as if they had a deep grudge against us and hated us to the bone. But more than 10 of our brothers died as well. Who is going to pay for their deaths? Even though Lord God Emperor repeatedly warned us not to cause any trouble before he left, we still have to deal with him. However, Qingyu Hall is so arrogant and despotic. How can we swallow this insult? They won't let this matter rest. We won't forgive them. Chapter 44-55. The 7 heavenly generals and more than 100 soldiers quickly cleaned up the battlefield and treated the wounded. The bodies and belongings of more than a dozen soldiers who had died in the battle were also collected by them. However, after cleaning up the battlefield, they did not return to the fleet. Instead, they continued to collect resources and mineral veins. In their opinion, they had spent a lot of effort and even had a conflict with the people of Qingyu Hall. More than 40 of them were killed or injured before they finally defeated the people of Qingyu Hall. Of course, they had to collect resources from this precious land of spiritual veins and excavate the mineral veins. Otherwise, they would not be able to face their brothers who had died or were seriously injured. On the other hand, they had just experienced a great battle and were still feeling very conflicted. They knew that they could not hide this matter. When they returned to the fleet, Marshal Zhuo would find out and they would be punished. Since they would be punished sooner or later, they had to collect more resources and treasures before they returned to the fleet. Only then would they be able to calm down. With this thought in mind, they covered their heads and collected resources with all their might. In less than half a day, all the natural treasures and rare fruits within a 10,000-mile radius had been collected by the soldiers. Then, they went underground and started to excavate the mineral veins and god stones. If it were not for these soldiers, Ji Tianxing could have summoned Yang and used his special ability to quickly excavate the mineral veins. However, with so many soldiers present, Yang could not appear. Therefore, Ji Tianxing came up with a plan. He asked the soldiers to stay underground and excavate the mineral veins while he left alone to find another team. The 7 heavenly generals asked him why he left. How could he not be tempted by so many mineral veins? Ji Tianxing replied. He was the leader of this operation and he was the one who brought everyone out. Since there had been trouble and casualties, he could not absolve himself from the blame. Although the mineral veins were tempting, he had more important things to do. The 7 heavenly generals and many soldiers were very grateful to him. They were willing to persuade Marshal Zhuo to bring everyone out to collect resources. When they heard that he had taken the responsibility, they admired him even more. Everyone asked him what he was going to do. If possible, they were willing to help. Ji Tianxing did not hide it from them and confided in them. Since there was no way to hide it, they would definitely be punished by Marshal Zhuo when they returned. He could not let the 7 heavenly generals and more than 100 soldiers be punished alone. He would drag another group of soldiers down with him as well. Anyway, the bigger the matter, the better. No matter how angry Marshal Zhuo was, he would have to abide by the principle that the law could not punish the masses and could not punish the masses. What was more, they were in the right. If things got out of hand, the Pure Moon Hall would be afraid. After all, they had the support of Bo Ri Emperor God, the future Sixth Palace Master. The Pure Moon Hall could not afford to offend the Sixth Palace Master. After listening to Ji Tianxing's fallacious reasoning, the eyes of the godly generals and the soldiers lit up as if they had seen the dawn of hope. It would be best if they could drag their companions down with them and reduce their own guilt and punishment, or even completely exempt them from the punishment. Everyone nodded their heads without hesitation and expressed their support for Ji Tianxing's way of doing things. They all had the idea of sharing blessings and suffering together. Then, the soldiers continued to mine the mineral veins underground. Ji Tianxing left the spirit veins and headed southeast to look for the 8 heavenly generals and 160 soldiers. In a situation where no one was traveling with him, there was no need for him to hide his strength. With his God Emperor realm strength, he managed to find that batch of soldiers in just a few hours. However, he was not in a hurry to show himself. He first searched the area and observed the situation. He remembered that the people from Qinyu Hall had said that they had been ordered to mine the mineral veins to complete their mission. If that was the case, there must be more than one group that had been ordered to mine the mineral veins. As expected, Ji Tianxing was right. After searching the area, he quickly found traces of the citizens of Qinyu Hall. 50 Qinyu Hall citizens, led by 2 deacons, were mining an underground mineral vein 500,000 miles away from the soldiers. Although the mineral vein was not big, its quality was extremely high. It was an important material for refining high and supreme-grade king-grade divine artifacts. The 50 Qinyu Hall citizens were all god kings. They did not notice the approaching danger and continued to mine the mineral vein. Ji Tianxing secretly set up a few seals around the mineral vein. Then, he turned around to look for the 8 heavenly generals and 160 soldiers. The soldiers were gathering cultivation resources in a lofty mountain range. They were extremely busy and excited. Ji Tianxing's sudden appearance surprised everyone. The 8 heavenly generals quickly surrounded him and greeted him. They also asked him why he was here. Ji Tianxing had already thought of an excuse. He explained that he had already settled down another group of soldiers and that they were mining a super mineral vein. He was worried that they would not be able to find a place with more abundant resources because they were inexperienced. Therefore, he specially came to take a look. The 8 heavenly generals were very touched when they heard this. At the same time, they were very envious of their companions. They complained to Ji Tianxing one after another. Although there were cultivation resources and treasures everywhere along the way, Ji Tianxing didn't have enough of them. However, the resources and treasures were too scattered, and there were not enough of them. It was a waste of time to collect them. This was exactly what Ji Tianxing wanted. He immediately smiled and said, "I knew this would happen. That's why I rushed over to help you. To tell you the truth, when I came out to collect resources and treasures last time, I searched the surrounding area. Not far ahead, there is a precious mineral vein hidden underground. It contains a large amount of top-grade god stones, gems, and ores. I have already marked that place. If you are interested, I can take you there now." When the 8 heavenly generals heard this, who would not be tempted? Everyone bowed to Ji Tianxing to express their sincere gratitude. Then, they quickly gathered their soldiers and followed Ji Tianxing to the mineral vein. What happened next did not need to be described in detail. It was probably within everyone's expectations. Ji Tianxing led more than 160 soldiers and rushed to the ore vein. The soldiers were in high spirits as they snatched the cultivation resources. The citizens of Qinyu Hall, who were mining the mineral vein underground, were dumbfounded. They were not prepared and did not know how to deal with these fellows who snatched their territory. When the 160 soldiers saw the citizens of Qinyu Hall here, they were also stunned. Everyone thought to themselves, Feiyang Shenwang had already marked this mineral vein. Why were the people of Qinyu Hall so domineering and came to mine it in advance? Then, both sides began to negotiate and quarrel. Both sides believed that the mineral vein belonged to them and asked the other side to collect resources elsewhere. Ji Tianxing showed them the marks around the mineral vein and said that he had marked it a few days ago and was ready to bring people to mine it. The people of Qingyu Hall were speechless. After being reprimanded by Ji Tianxing, they could only swallow their anger and leave sullenly. Chapter 4456. After the 50 members of the Pure Moon Hall had retreated, the more than 160 officers and soldiers had won the battle. They were all in high spirits. They didn't think too much about the consequences of their actions. All they knew was that Feiyang Shenwang had already marked this mine, so it was only natural that they would come here to mine it. Looking at the glittering mineral veins in the depths of the ground, everyone was extremely excited and could not wait to start digging. Ji Tianxing stayed for half a day as he watched everyone mining the ore vein. He left only after everyone's mining work went smoothly. He had already achieved his goal, so there was no way he could summon Yank and mine the mine in front of everyone. No matter how precious the mine was, he could only give it to the soldiers. After leaving, Ji Tianxing wandered around alone. He didn't need to hide his strength. With the speed of a god emperor, he searched the surrounding million miles and found several more precious mines and spirit veins. He left markings around the mines and spirit veins in case he needed them. After doing all this, he began to wander around the area. Within 3 days, he discovered 2 more groups of Qingyu Hall citizens. They were mining and collecting resources from the spirit veins. In order to continue with his previous plan, he secretly killed more than a dozen citizens of Qingyu Hall. Even though those 10+ citizens were all God King experts, they were all low-level and mid-level God Kings. Ji Tianxing was able to assassinate the members of the Pure Moon Hall without anyone noticing, and without leaving any trace behind. The 2 teams that had been ordered to mine the veins and collect cultivation resources were dumbfounded. They had no idea what had happened, nor did they know who had attacked them. However, other than the citizens of Qingyu Hall, there was only the Pan-God Emperor's fleet in Qingyu Hall's territory. Thus, it was extremely easy to pinpoint the culprit. The 2 teams guessed that the Pan-God Emperor's subordinates were behind the attack, but they couldn't produce any evidence. They could only return to 7 Moon Mountain dejectedly. Within 7 days, the 4 teams in charge of mining returned to 7 Moon Mountain one after another. None of the 4 teams were able to complete their mission. They didn't collect enough ores and cultivation resources. Moreover, the 4 teams all suffered different degrees of injuries and deaths. The first and second teams were fine. After returning to Mount 7 Moons, they went to meet the master of Qingyu Hall to explain how they were bullied. Their target was very clear. They were the divine generals under the command of the Prajna God Emperor. They had led over 100 soldiers to forcibly seize their mines and clashed with them. The other 2 groups were very sullen. Even though more than 10 of their people had been assassinated, they still didn't know who did it. They could only guess that it was a divine general under the command of the Prajna God Emperor, but they could not produce any evidence. Of course, with the experience of the previous 2 teams as proof, these 2 teams didn't need any evidence. It was done by the divine generals under the command of the Prajna God Emperor. After confirming the culprit, the citizens of the Qingyu Hall were filled with righteous indignation. Hundreds of thousands of people were discussing this matter. The 4 teams that had experienced trauma described the soldiers under the command of the Prajna God Emperor as especially arrogant, despotic, and cruel. This caused the citizens of Mount 7 Moons to be filled with resentment. The citizens hated the soldiers under the command of the Prajna God Emperor. Even the master of Qingyu Hall, the protectors, and the elders repeatedly persuaded the citizens not to anger the soldiers under the command of the Prajna God Emperor at such a special time. But how could the citizens listen to these words? In their opinion, they had already shown enough sincerity and welcome to the arrival of the Prajna God Emperor's fleet. Allowing the Prajna God Emperor's fleet to temporarily camp in the territory of Mount 7 Moons and allow them to mine resources and treasures was already very lenient. But the soldiers under the command of the Prajna God Emperor were actually so arrogant, despotic, and unscrupulous. They were simply invading bandits. No matter how modest and warm the citizens of the Qingyu Hall were, they would never allow such a thing to happen. They could be warm and hospitable, but they couldn't swallow their anger and retreat. Even if the Prajna God Emperor was about to be conferred the title of the 6th Hall Master after joining the Kongming Temple, everyone was well aware of this. But this wasn't an excuse for the Prajna God Emperor to allow her subordinates to wantonly bully the other halls. The Prajna God Emperor hadn't truly joined the Kongming Temple and been conferred the title of the 6th Hall Master, but the soldiers under her were already so arrogant. One could imagine how arrogant and despotic her fleet would be once she became the 6th Hall Master. At that time, wouldn't the Qingyu Hall be bullied wantonly and be suppressed to death by the Prajna God Emperor's fleet? With such feelings, the citizens of Mount Seven Moons were seething with resentment. They hated the Prajna God Emperor's fleet. In fact, the citizens even organized themselves and requested the master of Qingyu Hall to give the order to expel the Prajna fleet from their territory. Even though they didn't dare to seek revenge on the Prajna God Emperor's fleet, they could ask the other party to leave and end this dispute. But unfortunately, the master of Qingyu Hall couldn't make the decision, nor did he have the courage to do so. He was afraid of offending the Prajna God Emperor, and this was only one of the reasons. More importantly, calculating the time, the Prajna God Emperor shouldn't have arrived at the headquarters of the Kongming Temple yet. The Kongming Temple also didn't announce that the Prajna God Emperor had joined the temple, nor did they announce that she had become the 6th Hall Master. Before the news was announced, if the master of Qingyu Hall reported this matter, it would definitely cause conflict between the two sides. In fact, the Prajna God Emperor might even go back on his word and not join the Kongming Temple. How could the master of Qingyu Hall bear the responsibility for causing such a big mistake? Therefore, the master of Qingyu Hall, the protectors, and the elders discussed a few times before finally coming to a decision. They would temporarily suppress this matter. They used all kinds of methods, and even used the authority and power of the Hall Master to suppress the citizens' resentment. After settling the commoners of Seven Moon Mountain, they suppressed the 4 enraged troops. Even though the 4 teams that were ordered to collect resources had accumulated a bellyful of anger. But the master of Qingyu Hall had given a strict order, so they could only obediently obey and swallow their anger back into their stomachs. After resolving the internal problems, the master of Qingyu Hall brought 2 protectors and 6 elders to the Prajna God Emperor's fleet. In the past, when the two sides met, they would be very polite and cordial. But this time, the master of Qingyu Hall and the others were filled with anger. It was obvious that they were going to make a punitive expedition against the Prajna fleet. In fact, the master of Qingyu Hall and the others didn't want to do anything, and they didn't want to make a big deal out of it. Their goal was to let the commander of the Prajna God Emperor's fleet know about this matter and reason with him. The best outcome would be for the other side to admit their mistake, apologize, and severely punish the soldiers who made the mistake. This way, both sides would have a way out, and the master of Qingyu Hall would also be able to answer to the citizens. However, what made the master of Qingyu Hall and the others so depressed was that Marshal Zhou, who was in charge of the fleet, had no idea what was going on. In fact, when faced with the accusations of the master of Qingyu Hall and the others, Marshal Zhou insisted that it was a false accusation, a misunderstanding, and that it would never happen. Translator, Timothy_editor, Globeglotter. Chapter 4457. Everyone knew that the party that started the conflict would have to pay a heavy price. The Qingyu Hall was the victim, so it was only natural that they would not let the matter rest. The soldiers of the Prajna God Emperor had another fine tradition, and that was, as long as they were not caught red-handed, they would never admit to anything. No matter how the master of Qingyu Hall tried to reason with him, Marshal Zhou would not admit to anything. He insisted that the master of Qingyu Hall's one-sided statement did not count. His soldiers were very strict and would never make such a big mistake. In the end, both parties parted on bad terms. The master of Qingyu Hall returned to Seven Moon Mountain with a belly full of anger. Before this, the master of Qingyu Hall still had a glimmer of hope for the generals and heavenly generals under the Prajna God Emperor. If the other party had sincerely apologized and repented, he would have been willing to take a step back and not pursue the matter further. He could have turned the matter into a small one. However, the reactions of Marshal Zhua and the other heavenly generals made him lose all patience. He no longer had a glimmer of hope or tolerance. After returning to Seven Moon Mountain, many deacons and elders gathered around the master of Qinyu Hall to ask about the outcome. The master of Qinyu Hall looked solemn and did not want to say much. It was the deputy hall master who told everyone how shameless the other party was. Knowing that Marshal Zhua would not admit to his crimes, the elders and deacons were even more furious. They could not help but discuss and curse. Those foreign tribes deserve to die. We were so lenient and kind to them, but they turned out to be so cruel and heartless. I told you before that we shouldn't have lured those foreign tribes here. We were just inviting a wolf into our house. We gave in again and again. We were so lenient and kind to them, but they were not grateful at all. Instead, they became worse. What do those bastards want to do? Do they want to replace us? Those who are not of our tribe are not of our own tribe. We should not have contacted them in the first place. We should have driven them away. Driven them away? If we had known that they were so evil and hateful, we would have annihilated them. The deacons and elders spoke one after another to vent the anger in their hearts. Seeing that everyone was getting more and more ridiculous, the master of Qinyu Hall glanced at everyone and said, "Shut up. What's the point of all of you making a racket here? Don't forget that the few hall lords had already set the rules. Regardless of whether they encountered beings from the desolate race or the desolate race, they had to try their best to pacify and recruit them. They were not to attack without permission. Now that things have developed to this point, what we need to consider is how to resolve it. We can't let our people die in vain, but we can't completely break off relations with them. What's the point of regretting what you did in the past?" More than 30 elders and deacons fell silent. Because everyone knew that the truth was just as the master of Qinyu Hall had said. No matter how much they cursed, other than venting the dissatisfaction in their hearts, it was useless. Everyone calmed down, suppressed the anger in their hearts, and listened attentively to the master of Qinyu Hall's plan. The master of Qinyu Hall said in a low voice with a solemn expression, "Marshal Zhua also knows that this matter was caused by them. However, we didn't manage to catch them in the act. We didn't manage to capture those bastards who killed our people, so they refused to admit it. Since that's the case, we have to think of a way to capture those bastards and deliver them to Marshal Zhua. When the time comes, I'd like to see how Marshal Zhua will continue to quibble." Many of the guardians, elders, and deacons were deep in thought. They were considering the feasibility of this plan and how to proceed. The deputy hall master echoed, "Hall master is right. No matter how cunning that Marshal Zhua is, he has to be reasonable. Even if they have the support of the Prajna God Emperor, we don't have to be afraid. As long as we catch the culprits and have evidence, even if we report this to the hall masters, we will still be in the right. I don't believe that the hall masters will not distinguish between right and wrong in order to recruit the Prajna God Emperor." The guardians, elders, and deacons nodded in agreement. Everyone felt that this plan was feasible. Therefore, everyone enthusiastically expressed their willingness to lead the elite troops to capture the culprits. "Hallmaster, I am willing to lead the elite troops of our clan to search for the culprits. We will definitely arrest them. I am also willing to lead the troops to capture the culprits. Please, Hallmaster, help us." The two groups that killed our people each had more than 100 people. Most of them were divine sovereigns and a few were divine kings. To be on the safe side, we have to mobilize at least 100 divine kings to ensure that nothing goes wrong. I think that the two groups of culprits are wandering outside, and their positions are constantly changing. We should send out a few more teams and spread out to look for them. Once we find them, we should immediately notify the other troops to provide support to prevent any unforeseen events. That's right. We will send 5 troops, a total of 500 divine kings, to search for the two groups of culprits. It will be easy to capture them. Even if Marshal Zhua receives the news and wants to rescue the culprits, we have enough strength to capture them. If 500 people are not enough, we will send 1,000 or 2,000 divine kings. Anyway, we have enough divine kings in Qinyu Hall. We are not afraid of the Prajna fleet. This time, we must capture the culprit and force him to confess to his crimes obediently. Even Pan Ri God Emperor wouldn't be able to shield the soldiers under his command. It is not that we want to make a big deal out of this. We just want to seek justice. I believe that the hall masters can understand us. The guardians, elders, and deacons quickly came up with a plan of action. After listening to everyone's plan, the master of Qingyu Hall thought about it and nodded in agreement. A few hours later, 5 elders and 10 deacons gathered 500 divine kings and formed 5 troops. Each troop consisted of 100 elites with the strength of a mid-level divine king. The leader of each troop was an elder and 2 deacons. They were all high-level divine kings. The 5 troops quietly left Seven Moon Mountain and headed to the 2 areas where the incident happened. They split up and started to search. Moreover, the master of Qingyu Hall was still worried and had a backup plan. He ordered the 2 enforcers to each pick 50 elite experts to be on standby and ready to support the 5 teams. As for the master of Qingyu Hall and the vice hall master, they stayed at Seven Moon Mountain to monitor the movements of the 5 troops so that they could make timely arrangements. In this way, the Pure Moon Hall began their revenge action of redressing grievances. On the other hand, in the Prajna God Emperor's fleet, Marshal Zhuo was also furious. He sent a few jade slips to Ji Tianxing and the divine generals. Just as the master of Qingyu Hall had guessed, Marshal Zhuo also believed that his soldiers had offended the people of Qingyu Hall. However, he could not admit it so easily. He had to interrogate Ji Tianxing and the divine generals to find out what had happened. Chapter 4458. Feiyang Shimeng, what the hell are you doing? I trusted you so much and allowed you to bring everyone out to search for resources and treasures. You, on the other hand, have caused me so much trouble in just 2 days. How do you expect me to explain this to the God Emperor? The first person that Marshals was sent a message to reprimand was Feiyang Shunwang, the culprit. Before they set off, Marshals had repeatedly warned them that they could go out to search for resources and treasures, but they were not allowed to get close to Seven Moon Mountain, let alone get into a conflict with the people of Qingyu Hall. Marshal Zhuo was worried that the conflict between the 2 parties would affect the Prajna God Emperor's plan. After all, the Prajna God Emperor had strictly forbidden all soldiers to leave the fleet before he left. Marshal Zhuo had already violated the order and committed a grave mistake by allowing Ji Tianxing to bring people out to search for resources and treasures. If the Prajna God Emperor investigated this matter, Marshal Zhuo would be the first to bear the brunt and would be severely punished. Now, the thing that he was most worried about had happened. Feiyang Shunwang, whom he trusted and thought highly of, had finally committed a grave mistake and brought him great trouble. Marshals was sent Ji Tianxing 3 messages in a row, all of them angrily reprimanding and questioning him about what had happened. However, Ji Tianxing did not give him a reply. Therefore, Marshals was sent messages to the other heavenly generals, asking them what had happened. In the past, the heavenly generals treated Marshal Zhuo with respect and reverence. However, this time, the heavenly generals had all disappeared. None of them had replied to Marshal Zhuo's messages. Marshal Zhuo was furious. Marshal Zhuo was furious. He slammed the table and roared. When Ji Tianxing and the heavenly generals returned, he swore to arrest them and punish them severely. At the same time, the 15 heavenly generals were divided into 2 groups. They were commanding their soldiers to search for resources and veins with all their might. Ji Tianxing had not returned yet. He was still looking around for rare veins and spirit veins. Every time he found a spot, he would secretly mark it. He searched a radius of millions of miles and marked a total of 9 spots before returning to the first vein. He calculated the time. The teams from Qingyu Hall should have returned to Seven Moon Mountain to complain to the master of Qingyu Hall. Based on the style of the Pure Moon Hall master, she wouldn't recklessly send an army to arrest them. She would probably go to the fleet to reason with the left marshal. The Prajna God Emperor's heavenly generals, the God Emperor, should have known he would be responsible for the consequences. Therefore, Marshal Zhuo would God Emperor was Marshal Zhuo Feiyang of was Emperors Zhuo. However, Marshal Zhuo was kept in the dark and did not know what had happened. He would definitely send a message to him and the other heavenly generals to ask about what had happened. Ji Tianxing was thinking about how to deal with this situation. Soon after, Marshal Zhuo sent him a message and questioned him angrily. Ji Tianxing deliberately did not reply to the message. He quickly sent a message to the 15 heavenly generals of the two groups and reminded them how to deal with this situation. The master of Qingyu Hall has brought his men to the fleet to denounce us. He claimed that we were the ones who invaded and killed the people of Qingyu Hall. Marshal Zhuo is very angry. He has sent me a message and ordered me to bring everyone back to receive their punishment. Don't worry, when Marshal Zhuo sends a message to question you, you just have to follow my instructions and give him a unified reply. 15 jade slips were quickly sent to the heavenly generals. Everyone was happily collecting resources from the mineral veins and greedily absorbing the treasures. Everyone knew that their happiness was temporary and that they would soon be reprimanded and punished. However, they were addicted to the joy of collecting treasures and only hoped that the punishment would come later. When they received Ji Tianxing's message, they could imagine how angry Marshal Zhuo would be. They could not help but shiver. However, after hearing Ji Tianxing's plan, everyone heaved a sigh of relief and replied that they would follow his orders. Ji Tianxing received the replies from the 15 heavenly generals and rushed towards the fleet and 7 Moon Mountain. He planned to go back in advance to make some preparations for his next move. After flying for a few million miles, he saw a group of heavenly kings flying towards him in the sky in front of him. There were more than 100 divine king realm experts in the mighty troop. Furthermore, they were all members of the desolate race from the pure moon hall. Fortunately, Ji Tianxing had concealed his presence and aura. Even if the other party brushed past him, they would not notice anything amiss. He released his divine perception towards the southeast and detected another group of heavenly kings hundreds of thousands of miles away. They were rushing towards the area where the incident had occurred. There were also about 100 people in the group, and they were all heavenly king warriors from Qingyu Hall. Ji Tianxing could guess their intentions when he saw how aggressive the two groups were. It seems like Marshal Zhuo's attitude has infuriated the master of Qingyu Hall quite a bit. Otherwise, the master of Qingyu Hall would not have sent so many elite heavenly kings to find trouble with us. I was planning to do something to provoke the master of Qingyu Hall. I did not expect that they would not be honest and would retaliate so quickly. Since that is the case, it will save me a lot of trouble. Ji Tianxing immediately changed his plan. He quickly sent a message to the 15 heavenly generals and ordered them to retreat immediately and return to the fleet as quickly as possible. Then he sent a message to Marshal Zhuo. With a weak, angry, and helpless voice, he said a few words. Marshal, please calm down. We have been wrongly accused. We remembered your instructions and did not dare to provoke the citizens of Qingyu Hall, nor did we dare to go near the 7 Moon Mountain. I marked 2 mineral veins and resource-rich lands in a very remote place in advance and led the soldiers to mine them. But I did not expect the people of Qingyu Hall to be so overbearing. They claimed that the area around the 7 Moon Mountain was their territory and did not allow us to touch a single blade of grass or tree. Not only did they snatch the 2 mineral veins and rich resources that I had marked, they were also unreasonable and attacked our soldiers first. Although we were no match for them, we were not afraid of death. We could not disgrace Marshal Zhuo and tarnish the reputation of the God Emperor. We fought back with all our might and killed a few of their citizens. It was not easy for us to escape from their encirclement. However, dozens of our soldiers were killed and turned into ashes. We will never be able to return to the fleet. However, Qingyu Hall was too overbearing. They did not want to give up and sent a large number of immortal kings to kill us. Our soldiers have suffered heavy casualties and we do not know if they will survive. I didn't reply to you in time just now, so please forgive me, Marshal. No matter what, please send reinforcements immediately. If you need someone to take responsibility for this, I am willing to take all the blame. I only hope that Marshal Zhuo will not blame the innocent soldiers. You must save them. Ji Tianxing's voice and tone were very realistic. He portrayed a desperate heavenly general who was worried about the lives of his soldiers and was indescribably sad and indignant. Marshall Zhuo was furious when he heard this. You're tuning in to the Wang Lin's Journey YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.